Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. Hey Donovan. Man, I've been wrestling with myself about whether or not to share this, but after listening to some of the stories on your channel, I figured maybe someone out there might have seen what I saw. I live in a small town in Montana, right up against the Rocky Mountains. It's the kind of place where the wilderness is just a step away and folks still hold tight to the old ways. I'm a forest ranger, been doing it for close to 15 years now. I know these woods like the back of my hand, but something happened about a month ago that's got me questioning everything I thought I knew about this place. It was late afternoon and I was out on patrol in the truck. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting that golden light that makes everything look like a postcard. I was driving down an old logging road that hasn't been used in years. It's pretty overgrown, but I like to check it now and then for any signs of poachers. As I'm driving, I notice something strange up ahead. There's this tree, a big old pine, and it's shaking like crazy. I mean really shaking, like there's something big in the branches. But there's no wind, nothing that could be causing it. I stop the truck and get out to take a closer look. That's when I hear this sound, like a low growl. It's coming from the tree. I'm thinking maybe it's a mountain lion or a bear, so I grab my rifle just in case. As I get closer, the growling gets louder, and I can feel it in my chest. The tree is still shaking, and I can see the branches moving. Then, all of a sudden, this thing drops out of the tree onto the ground. I can't even begin to describe what I saw. It was big, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, and covered in this dark, shaggy fur. But it wasn't a bear. Its arms were too long, and it had these hands with long fingers and claws. Its face was almost human, but the eyes were too big and the nose was all wrong. It looked at me, and I swear, Donovan, I felt like it was looking into my soul. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. We just stood there staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it turned and ran off into the trees. It moved so fast like nothing I've ever seen. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I didn't feel scared exactly. More like, I don't know, like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. I didn't say anything to the other rangers. I know what they'd think, but I did some asking around town real quiet like. An old timer named Earl, who's lived in these parts longer than anyone, told me his granddad used to talk about the old ones, beings that lived in the mountains long before people came here. He said they were guardians of the forest and that they could see into a man's heart. I don't know what to believe, but I can't just pretend like it didn't happen. I still go out on patrol, still drive down that old logging road, but it's different now. The forest doesn't feel the same, like I'm not alone out there. Anyway, I wanted to share this with you and whoever else might be listening. Maybe someone else has seen something like this. Maybe there's someone out there who understands what it was. I don't have any grand conclusions or anything. I'm just a guy who saw something he can't explain. But I guess that's how it goes sometimes. The world's a big place, and there's a lot in it that doesn't make sense. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything needs an explanation. Maybe some things are just meant to be mysteries. Thanks for giving folks like me a place to share our stories, Donovan. It means a lot. Take care and keep your eyes open out there. Hey Donovan, I've got to get this off my chest, man. I've been carrying this around for a couple weeks now, and it's eating me up inside. I live in a small town in upstate New York, surrounded by dense forests in the Catskill Mountains. I'm a trucker by trade, and I've seen a lot of miles, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered on a back road near my hometown. It was late, around 3 a.m., and I was hauling a load back from Pennsylvania. I decided to take a shortcut through the woods that I've used 100 times. The night was pitch black, the kind where the darkness feels almost heavy, you know. The only light came from my truck's headlights. As I'm driving, I notice something up ahead in the road. I slow down thinking it's a deer, but as I get closer, I realize this ain't no deer. This thing was standing on two legs hunched over. It was covered in this thick matted fur, but its arms were long and almost looked human. But the hands, man, the hands were these gnarled, clawed things that looked like they could rip through steel. I hit the brakes and just sat there staring at this thing. It turned and looked at me, and I swear its eyes were this sickly yellow and seemed to glow. Its face was almost human but twisted and wrong. The mouth was too wide, and the teeth were like jagged knives. It let out this sound, like a scream and a growl mixed together. It was so loud it shook the windows of my truck. I felt like the sound was inside my head, and my whole body felt like it was being pulled toward this thing. I don't know how long I sat there, but suddenly it lunged to the side and disappeared into the trees. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was gonna burst out of my chest. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't get the image of that thing out of my head. The way it looked at me, it was like it knew me, like it saw right through me. The next day, I talked to my buddy Mark. He's lived in the area his whole life, and he's heard all the stories. I told him what I saw, and he went pale. He said his granddad used to tell him stories about creatures in the woods, things that weren't human but weren't animal either. He said they were guardians or spirits or something. His granddad used to leave out offerings of food, trinkets, to keep them from coming too close to the house. I don't know what to believe, man, but I know what I saw. I've driven that road since, and every time I get to the spot where I saw that thing, my skin crawls, and the hair on the back of my neck stands up. I wanted to share this with you because I don't know who else to talk to. People around here don't talk about this stuff like it's some kind of taboo, but I can't just pretend it didn't happen. I keep thinking about what Mark's granddad said about guardians or spirits. I don't know if that's what I saw, but I feel like it was something old. Something that's been here a lot longer than any of us. I guess I just want people to know that there's stuff out there that we don't understand. The world's a big place, and sometimes we catch a glimpse of the things that hide in the shadows. Maybe they're just trying to live their lives, same as us. Maybe they're protecting something. I don't know. But I'll tell you this, Donovan. Since that night, I feel like I see the world a little differently. When I'm out on the road driving through the night, I feel like I'm a part of something bigger. Like there's a whole world out there just beyond the headlights, full of mysteries and wonders that most folks never even dream of. I don't know if that thing I saw was a guardian or a spirit or something else entirely, but I know it was real, and I know that it changed me. So, to anyone reading this, keep your eyes open, respect the world around you, and remember that we're not alone. There are things out there in the forests, in the mountains, in the dark corners of the world, and sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of them. Thanks for letting me share my story, Donovan. Keep doing what you're doing, man. The world needs more folks who are willing to listen. Hey there, Donovan. I'm reaching out to you because, well, I don't really know who else to talk to. My name's Jake, and I work at a gas station off Route 66 in Arizona. It's one of those places where tumbleweeds are more common than people. Now, I ain't much of a storyteller, but I gotta tell someone about the night that just about turned my hair white. So it was a regular Tuesday night, and I was working the graveyard shift. I was sitting behind the counter flipping through a car magazine when this old lady walks in. She looked like she was about 100 years old, all hunched over and wearing this big heavy coat, which was weird because it was like 80 degrees outside. She comes up to the counter and tells me in this raspy voice that something is coming. I'm like, hello, is there something specific you need help with? She just keeps saying that something is coming and that I need to be ready. Then she turns around and leaves. I figured she was just a bit loony, you know. Fast forward a couple of hours, and I'm restocking the shelves. Suddenly, the lights start flickering, and there's this weird humming sound. I thought maybe there was something wrong with the electricals, but then I looked outside. There was this thing standing by the gas pumps. It was tall, like real tall, and it was just standing there, looking at the station. I couldn't make out much of its features, but it looked like it was made of shadows or something. Like it was there, but not really there, if that makes any sense. I locked the front door and grabbed my phone to try and take a picture, but the darn thing wouldn't work. The shadow thing started moving toward the station, and I swear the ground was shaking with each step it took. I don't know why, but I remembered what the old lady said about being ready. I didn't know what for, but I started thinking maybe this was it. I don't know what came over me, but I stepped outside and shouted, "Hey, what do you want?" The thing stopped and turned its head towards me. For a second, everything was silent. Then, in a voice that sounded like 100 voices all at once, it said, "Lost." Just that one word, but it felt like it echoed through me. I don't know why, but I pointed down the road and said, "Route 66. That way." The thing looked in the direction I was pointing, and then, just like that, it faded away into the night. The lights stopped flickering, and the humming sound was gone. Everything was just normal again. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't know what it was looking for, but I think maybe it was just trying to find its way, like all of us. I haven't seen the old lady or the shadow thing since that night, but sometimes when I'm working the late shift, I think about them. I wonder where they came from and where they were going. I absolutely love the outdoors and have always been really into camping, hiking, whitewater, rafting, fishing, and all that kind of stuff. My passion for the outdoors began when I was a young child growing up in Illinois. Admittedly, I have always been fascinated by the mysteries of the natural world, and I have spent countless hours researching and studying various paranormal phenomena. I had always secretly hoped I would be able to encounter something paranormal, since I thought there was this romantic allure to experiencing something so life-changing. I definitely got my wish. However, I must say that I'm just grateful that I was able to escape with my life. One summer, while visiting a friend in the Appalachian Mountains, I had an encounter that I will never forget. I had just finished college and was taking a road trip through the Appalachian Mountains to my buddy's cabin. But one day, we decided to go on a day hike through the woods. As we were walking, we heard a strange noise coming from the trees above us. As we got closer, the noise became increasingly horrifying, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like a low demonic growl, and it seemed to be coming from all over the place, almost like it was coming from multiple sources at once. Then I saw something big moving around in the trees. I asked my friend what it was, and he said he had no idea. It was hard to make out what was causing the movement, but it was definitely something large and powerful, and it made loud thumps as it moved. We figured it might be a bear or something, but we still had no idea what made that growl. We eventually got to a creek, and there, standing at the edge, was this thing crouched over, drinking some water. Its back was turned to us, so we both took cover behind some trees to get a closer look, without it knowing we were there. It got up, turned around, and that's when we saw it was a huge, beastly figure with long, thin limbs and a pale white complexion. Its eyes were a bright, piercing blue, and its face was twisted and ugly. The thing seriously must have been at least 9 feet tall, and we were both in shock at the sight of it. We should have just run away right then, but we were just in awe of this thing. It had antlers like a deer and looked like something out of Warcraft. Then all of a sudden, it just stopped dead still and then swung its head around to look right at us. It knew we were there. Immediately, my friend and I took off through the woods back where we came from, trying not to scream the whole way. It roared at us, which was painful to listen to. The roar came from all around, and I was sure that thing was going to kill us. My friend claims that I ran first, but I know he did. If he didn't run first, he at least screamed first. I'm usually very good in emergency situations, but I admit it, I was terrified. We made it safely back to my friend's house, and based on the physical description of a creature we found online, we determined that what we came so close to was a Wendigo. We discovered that a Wendigo is a creature from Native American folklore that was said to be a malevolent spirit that possessed humans and turned them into cannibalistic monsters. The more we learned about the Wendigo, the more we realized how horrifying it truly is. We found this Native American shaman online who claimed to have knowledge of the Wendigo and had the capabilities to harness the power of the spirit world to free this possessed spirit and end this Wendigo's insatiable hunger for human flesh. We were both broke, but after seeing the creature in person, we couldn't live with ourselves if we knew we could free the poor person from spending their afterlife as such a horrific beast. We both pooled our money together and drove to the shaman's remote cabin and spent several days meditating, chanting, drinking plant medicines, and preparing for the ritual. The night of the ritual was one of my life's most intense and terrifying experiences. We took peyote and the shaman chanted and performed all kinds of crazy rituals, while my friend and I battled with our own inner demons. At one point, the room was filled with a thick mist, and we could feel the evil presence of the Wendigo all around us. Finally, after endless hours of chanting, ritualistic dancing, and deep energetic work, the shaman announced that the spirit had been purged and released from its curse. He told us that the spirit world would bless us for our selfless acts, and the free spirit and his ancestors would now be our guardian angels. He told us that everything we do in life has consequences, whether we could see them or not. That always stuck with me. The experience left me with a newfound respect for the power of the supernatural. There are things in this world that were beyond my understanding, and we must approach them with caution and respect. Although I was relieved that the Wendigo had been defeated, I knew that I would never forget the terror I felt during that whole experience. The encounter with the Wendigo and the shamanistic ritual permanently changed me in ways that my mortal mind cannot understand. It has made me more aware of the mysteries of our world and universe, and I now respect and fear the supernatural. I knew that I would never forget the experience, and that it would always be a part of who I was. If you told me when I was a kid that I would have multiple paranormal experiences of my own, I would have been over the moon. But being on the other side, life was much simpler when I was just a blind believer. I suppose it is expected that anybody who chooses to follow in the footsteps of Smokey, the bear, would possibly be stuck in a few scary situations. That certainly was the case for me, as I spent my nights working alongside park rangers on some of the most dangerous and terrifying trails in the States. It's not what one might think about being a ranger, though we don't spend every day sitting around watching deer graze or children play in the playgrounds. Instead, what happens behind those locked gates is something more akin to horror movies than a picnic. If you manage to find your way through these wooded corridors without being eaten alive by some wild animal or eaten by a bear, you could end up with some serious psychological damage. As my first summer as a ranger was coming to an end, I decided that I wanted to spend one last night in the woods alone. Not many rangers do that kind of thing anymore, but for me, it was sort of this cleansing ritual. My girlfriend had just broken up with me at the time, and I needed time to work through that emotional trauma. I knew there were other people who understood my pain. They would be likely willing to talk about the world ending when we got close enough in proximity. But every man needs his space from time to time, even if he is working within the confines of the law. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what to expect out there in the woods with no one else around. I had been alone quite a few times before, but never encountered any real trouble. But this time, my mind was racing through the worst-case scenarios, and it almost felt like fate that I would get caught up in some kind of adventure by myself. Either I was going to find somebody who could relate to my situation, or perhaps even fall for them as they helped me through it all. Anyway, I made it to the trailhead and then began hiking down towards my favorite spot at Lake Oroville State Park. The entire park is beautiful, located not far from Sacramento, but until you're actually standing deep within its borders, you can't truly grasp its beauty. I loved watching the weather rolling over the water, feeling the cold air as it rushed past my face and into my lungs, waking me up from the lazy afternoon nap. I felt at peace with myself every time I visited this spot, but not so much that other people bothered me. That's why this was almost certainly going to be a good night. I had just crossed over one of the small bridges leading across the lake when I heard something rustling behind me, more similar to low growls than anything else. Really, it sounded like something was stalking towards me, perhaps a bear. The only thing about these sounds that didn't scream bear were their frequency. They were more sporadic than I would have expected. My ears picked up the distinct sound of footsteps more than once, actually, as if somebody were running towards me directly through the thicket. Not wanting to meet with whatever was out there on my own terms, I scrambled for one of the trees and threw myself up into it to try and hide. Unfortunately, jumping back had cost me more time than I realized, and by the time I reached around and grabbed hold of a branch, something hit me hard, right in the side. You know, it feels like forever before I felt like landing against something soft and squishy. It wasn't exactly warm or inviting, so all of those other feelings must just be an illusion brought on by adrenaline. It only took a single moment for me to realize what had been happening, that I had been wrapped at the ankles, waist, shoulders, and neck in some kind of netting. I didn't know what exactly it was made out of, but it wasn't rope. It was some sort of binding material. My hands were completely immobilized by entanglement as well, so there wasn't much I could do other than struggle against my bonds. A dead-end endeavor, if there ever was one. Now, the first thing I noticed when I could finally see again is that it was completely dark around me. All light was coming from behind with only blackness ahead. Two dim lights appeared along the walls on either side of me and began approaching slowly. As my eyes now adjusted, they looked more like natural animal eyes than any sort of man-made illusions. Even worse, I noticed that the blackness ahead of me wasn't really coming from a lack of light at all. Instead, there appeared to be some kind of organic wall blocking my view, spreading out across the room to each side. I had no idea how large this place was, but it must have been bigger than what I could see. One behind me and another in front of me. They made themselves known moments later. The noises were too far away for me to make out at first, but then I could hear that they belonged to something, and more than two. At this point, fear began gripping my heart as I lashed out against my bonds once again, only to find that they hadn't been loosened in the slightest. More so, I thought. We'll get to that in a moment. I was hauled from my small prison by several sets of long clawed hands that dragged me over what appeared to be some kind of altar. It was much different from one of those sacrificial altars appearing to be used in ancient times for rituals. The ones to appease otherworldly beings were said to lurk within the space between two worlds. But this one seemed more like a place where people got together for satanic worship or other unholy activities. These beings holding me lorded me down onto it and began weaving some sort of flower all around me while chanting something in this ungodly language. I was so terrified. I swear I could have had a heart attack. I couldn't make out all the words, but I had no idea what this thing was or what they were saying. The entire group of these things began chanting in unison as they surrounded me, continued weaving more of this plant material around me. It felt like forever before they finally got to the last one. All I could do was just lay there on my back, completely immobilized by flowers, while these creatures circled around me once and turned their backs towards me. The chant stopped abruptly, and every creature but one turned to leave. The remaining one tossed this mask aside, revealing a set of devilish features underneath it. What I had been dealing with looked like a combination of wild, feral human beings and kind of goblinish people. You know, it kind of reminded me of the trolls or orcs in Lord of the Rings. Humanoid, but also not human. That's what they reminded me of. It stood there, shaking its head from side to side slowly, with its arms raised upward as I tried to break free. Now again, I cannot reiterate how terrifying this was. I had no idea what was going to happen, And I was convinced in that moment I was about to be sacrificed by some sort of underground dwelling creatures. I was so scared, beyond belief. Then this thing pulled its arm down after shaking its head and walked away, completely immobilized. I tried my best to get out of my entrapment. I believe it was the massive amounts of adrenaline exploding through my entire being that allowed me to break free. As I did though, I could hear these things coming back, and I knew I had to escape as quickly as I could. Once fully free, I started to run for it, escaping in just a matter of time, feeling my way out of this black, organic labyrinth. I don't know if I was in a cave or what this was, but as I reflect back on these memories, so much flooding through my mind, I feel like I kind of blacked out. I don't really know if I remember much after that, but I do distinctly remember collapsing on the ground and being found later on. I know that's probably very anticlimactic, but when the human body endures that kind of trauma and stress, it does things to the brain that aren't exactly normal. Anyway, I was treated at the hospital, ultimately taken back to the station and sent home. I didn't actually believe what I experienced at first. I thought it was some crude nightmare or horrible hallucination. But it wasn't until later that I realized it must have been something that really happened, because I actually had binding marks around my ankles, my thighs, my waist, and my wrists. Those bindings were tight, and I must have wiggled free enough that I loosened them. Like I said, whatever the bindings were, they were this crude rope vine material. I've never seen it before in my life. None of them really believed me though, when I actually got a chance to describe what happened. They thought I was either making it up or just had a bad nightmare. As you can probably bet, this incident has been difficult for me. At any rate, this is my story, and I hope you can get enjoyment from a real-life traumatic event. I don't care if you believe me, and if you choose to read this, which, by the way, you have permission to, I don't care if your readers believe me. I know there's something out there that lives underneath the ground, something that isn't quite human. I got a job near a large national park reserve in BC. Unfortunately, it was more than 2 hours away from the apartment I was renting at the time, so I had to move. The only rental, literally the only rental in town, was an old farmhouse out in the woods. I took the rental before even seeing it because it was my only option. The job was good enough that I didn't care about the house. I figured something else would come up soon enough, so it didn't really matter. That was my first mistake. The house was about 20 minutes from my new job, so not too bad there. However, it was about 7 kilometers down a dirt road deep in the forest. The house itself used to be part of a farm that was repurposed into a Girl Scout camp. The camp was subsequently moved elsewhere, and the main lodge was turned back into a house. Living alone in this big, old, lonely house in the middle of the woods was a bit creepy, I'll admit, but that wasn't the worst part. Not by a long shot. The worst part was at the end of the road. I was the last house on that road, but the road extended for another 2 kilometers before abruptly ending in the woods. And there, at the end of the road, was where the town dumped all of the roadkill from the nearby freeway. None of this was disclosed to me before I agreed to rent the house. And I know what you're thinking, but I couldn't move. Not right then anyway. I was on the lookout for something else to open up, but I was stuck in the farmhouse for the time being. Every once in a while, I would hear what I thought was some kind of animal moving around outside of my house at night. Not surprising since I was so close to the park. It wouldn't really do anything, but it did get pretty close to the house on a couple occasions. And once I heard it get up on the porch and walk around. Now, I wouldn't exactly call myself a coward, but I wasn't about to go out there and confront it, especially if it turned out to be a bear or a moose. For the most part, it left me alone, and I was content with that. The time I heard it on the porch, I did turn the porch light on to try to get a glimpse of it, but it ran into the woods before I could. I didn't realize it at the time, but the creature did have a purpose for its visits. Whatever it was surviving off the carcasses that were being dumped at the end of the road. If it had enough food down there to keep it happy, it stayed at the end of the road. But when it ran out, it would go wandering, and that's when it would show up at my house. I called the local authorities and told them about the animal and that I thought it might be dangerous. Essentially, they told me there was nothing they could do at that point. If it became a problem on my property, they would come out and destroy it, but since I hadn't even seen the animal at that point, they weren't going to do anything about it, so I stayed inside at night and tried to ignore it. I started documenting everything. I would drive down to the end of the road and record how much food the creature had that day. Without fail, when it ran low on food, it would show up around my house. This is when I started getting scared. I knew it was hungry and whatever it was. It probably saw me as food, and I didn't know how far this thing was willing to go to get a meal. It was about a month after that when I heard of the bear attacks in the park. A couple of people got mauled and several more had their cars, campers, and tents all destroyed by some rogue bear. I knew immediately that this was the animal that lived at the end of my road. The attacks all happened on nights where this thing didn't have enough food. I called the Park Service and told them of my theory, but instead of tracking down and destroying the bear, they just started feeding it more. But they couldn't keep up with it. There weren't enough casualties on the freeway to keep this thing fed, and its behavior started escalating. Instead of walking around the outside of my house, it started scratching at the doors and windows. One night, I was afraid it was going to break down the wall and get in. I ended up calling police. They came out and cleared the area. The officer told me that they were dealing with the situation the best they could, but it was going to take time and that I should just stay inside away from the doors and windows until they could put the bear down. I remember the officer that spoke to me seemed frightened, like there was something else he wasn't telling me. The activity didn't stop, but I did notice that they were feeding it more. That seemed to help some, but it got so bad that I started feeding the beast myself there, at the end of the road when it was running low, just to keep it away from me. It worked. I was wasting quite a bit of money on chicken meat, but it kept the creature satisfied. I drove out there every night after work to make sure it had enough food. I know it was stupid, but what else was I going to do? One night I went to drop a chicken off for it, and I was a bit later than usual. It was almost dusk. I never got out of the car, I just drove to the edge and threw it out the window. And that's when I finally saw it. And it wasn't a bear, not by a long shot. On first glance, it looked like a large wolf. It was hunched over on all fours, so it would have been easy to mistake it for one. But there was something odd about it that made me stay and watch it for a moment. I kept my car running so I could drive away in a second if I needed to. I remember its eyes. They were yellow, almost golden against dark fur that was either gray or black. I couldn't quite tell. It was waiting for me, watching me from between the trees. I threw the chicken out the window, but the creature didn't approach. It was waiting for me to drive away. I waited there for a couple of minutes, but the animal wasn't going to come out of the woods with me there. So I started driving off back down the road. I saw it in the rearview mirror. The creature stood up on two legs, just like a man, and walked out of the woods to grab the chicken. I couldn't get a good view of it from there, but it appeared to have usable hands. Like, it could grab things with them. It picked the chicken up and walked back into the woods. That's when I realized everything that was going on. Why that officer was so afraid. Why the park wouldn't do anything about this creature. And why this was the only rental available in the town. They were feeding it out here to keep it away from the national park. This was all on purpose. As long as it had a steady food source, it left everyone alone. When it ran out of food and would go searching in the park, they called it a bear attack. I lived in the house for another 6 months before I found a decent place to move. And I made sure this thing never ran out of food while I was there. I don't know what happened after I moved out, but I did make a stop down to the park and asked to talk to the rangers. I told them I knew about the creature in the woods, and that I knew it wasn't a bear, and that I had been feeding it just like they had been doing, but I was moving out soon and it was going to be hungry. No one spoke a word to me. They didn't acknowledge they knew about the creature, but I knew they knew, and that was that. My name is Charlie. I'm a paramedic at West Penn Hospital in Pittsburgh, and I've been working here for a little over 3 years. I'm on a rotating schedule, so sometimes I work nights and weekends. Last month, I came in on the ambulance with one of my patients. He only had a broken leg, so after we got him checked out, things were pretty quiet for me. It was a little after midnight, and my partner went to go smoke with some of the nurses. When I've got time to kill, I usually hang out in the lounge. We get a few lounge rooms to ourselves, and I like to hang out by the one over by the pediatrics wing. It's got a nice view of the city because it's on the top floor, and you can hear the air ambulance come in. Now, for those who don't know, we really don't use the air ambulance that much. I'd say it flies out 4 times a month. So when I heard it come in that night, I assumed that was it. But then it flew back out, and I've got nowhere else to be, so I just stay in the lounge. The air ambulance flew in about 10 minutes later, unloaded, then went out again. Now I'm concerned, right? Because usually if they're sending trips out back and forth, it means there's been a major accident, like a remote highway collapse or something. So I'm checking my phone to see if anything broke the news, but there's nothing. Now the way the air ambulance is set up, it's got this special landing pad and entryway. You can't get to the roof without being buzzed up, and they can get the patient into the hospital without being seen. And no one's called me or my partner. I don't think the paramedics have been called at all. And that's weird because with this many emergency patients, I figured they need help with transport. I'm really curious now, so I head out of the lounge and deeper into the hospital. The closest I can get to the landing pad is this entryway right above our skywalk. I'm hoping to at least catch one of the nurses that would be on their way to help. But I don't see anyone. Usually there'd be a whole hub of people waiting to get buzzed in. I'm the only one out here. I can hear other nurses and doctors on the other side of the wall. They're doing something and everybody's moving. Whoever's working on this, the other hospital personnel aren't being called in to help. I call my partner and tell him to meet me up here. And that's when I start getting all these weird thoughts in my head. Like I have these memories of being wheeled down one of the halls or getting poked at by all these doctors I've never even seen before. I know none of it's true, but it feels so real. I start getting really dizzy. I feel all these needles going into my body. And I'm feeling angry, right? Like I want to fight back. I don't like being shoved around. I want these people to get off me. All of a sudden, there's this yelling coming from the other side of the wall. It snaps me out of it. There's all this banging around and I hear someone calling for restraints. The door buzzes and I rush inside to see what's going on. The medics are already at the other end of the hallway. I run after them and there's so much chaos that no one hears. I'm getting closer and I realize that some of the doctors have blood on them. That group turns the corner with their patient. By the time I turn the corner, they're all loaded into the elevator. Before the doors close, I see this little gray foot hanging off the side of the gurney. Then they're gone. You can't use that elevator without a security key card, so I can't follow them. I have no idea what floor they're going to, so I head back out to the main hospital. By then, my partner is in the hallway and he asks me what I saw. I tell him everything and I can't tell if he believes me, but I want to get to the bottom of this, and so I'm hoping I'll be scheduled on the night shift again soon. I'm also hoping that eventually the air ambulance will start up again, and this time I'll be able to catch a proper look at whatever they're hiding. I don't really know what else to do or what I'm expecting to find, but if I see anything more, I'll be sure to write in again. I should start by saying that I'm not typically prone to believing in stories of strange creatures. I mean, I've always been a serious person with a serious job. I'm a chief warrant officer, and I've been in the Navy for 25 years. And I've spent plenty of time out in the wild. I started hunting with my dad when I was 12 years old. I've never been one to scare easily. I've been in combat and had to deal with all kinds of dicey situations. Anyway, me and my buddy Bill like to go hunting wild pigs on my cousin's farm down in Florida. It's a little south of Jacksonville. I would never go alone. It was a 2-person job. One person would man the spotlight and the other would have the rifle. We'd roam through the cornfields until we heard animals rustling around. Then we'd hit them with the spotlight and take our shots. This time I'm talking about, we went out on a night in January. It was pretty cold, probably down in the 40s. We drove out and then we walked out to a field where we'd known the pigs to hang out. We settled in there to listen. There was no moon and it was cloudy, so it was just about as dark as you can get. It was just the right conditions to get some pigs. It wasn't too long before we started hearing some rustling and grunting. Bill hit the spotlight and we saw 5 or 6 pretty big pigs. I had my lever action rifle ready and I fired at the biggest pig and downed him with a shot behind the ear. The pigs panicked and I got off about 3 more shots, but they went kinda high and the pigs made it to the tree line. My ears were ringing and my adrenaline was pumping. I was really wishing I'd gotten more than one. We started walking toward the one on the ground, but as soon as I took a step toward it, we heard a scream. It was a loud, angry scream. It sounded like it was close. I was like, what the hell was that? Bill looked at me all freaked out. He shone the light around and scanned the open field and the trees at the edge. We couldn't see anything. He started to say something, but we heard the scream again. It seemed closer and louder. It was really loud, but really raspy. Like if you went to a football game and screamed and hollered and wound up losing half your voice. And the next day, you tried to scream as loud as you could for 10 seconds. That's what it sounded like. Bill said, "Give me your pistol, we need to get out of here." I had a pistol on me along with the rifle. I handed him my .45 pistol, but I said, "What about the pig?" He said, "Screw the pig." We were about a mile away from the truck on a 1,000-acre farm with some kind of demon thing screaming at us in the pitch black. We started to feel panicky. We found the track we had followed in and started to walk away fast, but we kept turning back to scan the area, thinking we were about to see something come after us. Then we heard it again and turned around and saw this thing on the path about 50 feet away. This creature was about 4 feet tall and was staring at us with red eyes. It had spikes down its back with leathery gray skin. It looked hairless to me. It gave us this weird grin, and I swear it looked like it only had like 3 long teeth in the front of its mouth. The hind legs looked huge. It was like we were paralyzed trying to figure out what the hell we were looking at. Then Bill remembered he had the pistol and raised it, and the thing took off into the corn. We finally came to our senses and started running full speed toward the truck. I don't remember if there were any more screams. My adrenaline was way up and all my focus was on running as fast as I could without tripping and falling. We made it back to the truck and hightailed it back to my cousin's house. On the ride home, we were trying to calm ourselves down. But Bill just kept saying, what the actual hell was that? No freaking way that was a hog. And all I could say was, it sure as hell wasn't. We got back to my cousin's house where they had made a bonfire and were standing around it. We must have still looked pretty wild-eyed, because my cousin came over and handed us 2 beers right away and was like, rough night. Did you get a pig? Yeah, we left a pig out there. Maybe we'll get it in the morning. He looked pretty confused, and then we both just started telling him about the crazy screaming, and he said, yeah, raccoons can make some really wild noises. Then we told him what we saw, and he seemed to get a little pale. And he started telling us about this weird thing that had happened with his neighbor's sheep the week before. He said almost 10 sheep had been found slaughtered, and they were completely drained of blood with strange puncture marks on their chests. And we could tell he felt weird about saying this. But then he said the neighbor thought a chupacabra had gotten them. I'd heard that word before, but I thought it was just some weird legend from South America or something. And that was that. We got the pig the next day. We felt okay going out there in the daylight. But honestly, I don't know that I'd want to be out there in the dark ever again. Anyone who lives in New Jersey knows we've got enough other problems than to worry about whether or not the ghosts from our state's past are real. Hauntings, witches. I think we even have Bigfoot sightings. I don't know. Like I said, we've got enough problems. What I do know, I'll tell you, is the Pine Barrens. The pretty side of South Jersey might as well be another planet. Trees, bogs, eagles, and black bears. Yeah, the black bears have been showing back up. It ain't New Ark, that's for sure. It's beautiful. It's a part of nature that most people don't think touches Jersey anymore. I like the Pine Barrens for that reason. That's also the reason I travel down once per season to the little town of Hamilton. Blueberry capital of the world, or so the sign says. I believe it. Blueberries are the state fruit. That's another detail most people from the north side might stumble over. Not down in Hamilton. It might have something to do with the 50 million blueberries that come out of New Jersey each year. But down in Hamilton, people are in touch with that beautiful side of nature. So each year I take a trip, volunteer with the blueberry harvest, and find as many excuses as I can to explore the bogs and backwoods of the area. I find little souvenirs, usually rocks, and take them home as part of my collection. When I'm in a funk, maybe feeling the wear and tear of city life, I look over my collection and reminisce over the blueberry season. It helps maybe half the time. Scotch helps with the other half. This season, my souvenir means something a little different. Looking at the flat oval-shaped rock with the porous red surface reminds me of what I escaped. It reminds me that, as well as I know the Pine Barrens, maybe I don't want the Barrens to know me. There were still blue stains on my fingertips when I entered the woods. I helped with the harvest that morning and had worked up a yearning for exploration. I was getting my fix as the trees grew dense enough to block out the buildings behind me. My eyes were already scouring the earth for a trinket that I could claim as my own. Most of the rocks in that area were exceedingly common. If I grabbed one of them, it would be hard to distinguish this trip from any other. I kept walking, deeper and deeper. I'd made the journey many times before. I still don't believe that I traveled too far into those woods. The ground around me still showed signs of being trampled by the other guests of Hamilton. I think maybe the thing that I saw wandered too close to town. I cursed under my breath when I first caught a glimpse of the animal and dropped down to one knee. It was a buck, or so I thought. I only saw its snout and rack creeping out from behind a mound of mud and brush. When it kept walking, the air hitched in my throat. Broad shoulders followed the head of the buck, broad enough that I could have mistaken the animal for a horse. Those shoulders, however, were covered in scales. I thought perhaps the animal I was looking at was diseased. I half-crawled backward to give it a little more space. Then I saw the wings. Folded down the center of its back was a pair of massive bat-like wings. Leathery webbing, scaled and rigid arms. Was it a new species? The thing stood upright, hunched over and balancing on its hooved hind legs. Its anatomy was hard to comprehend at the moment. Even now, it feels like I'm imagining pieces of different animals that I've mistakenly assembled onto the same body. I wanted to vomit. I don't know whether it was the shock permeating through my body or the proximity to the creature itself, but all I could smell was sulfur. It burned my nose and lungs. I continued my backward crawl when it turned and saw me. My hand landed on something small and porous, tightened around it in case it was about to become the only weapon I had in a fight for my life. Its red eyes didn't look away. It stared a long while instead. It looked over my entire body. I felt like I was being measured. I knew everything from the sweat on my brow to the blueberry stains on my fingers was being judged and weighed against me. It wasn't a new species. It was old. I could feel its age in the look it gave me. I could tell that I wasn't the first human being that this beast had gazed upon. I wondered what had happened to all the others. This was one of the ghosts of my state, something strange and dangerous we worked to forget. And I was here on the outskirts of its home, the place where nature started to reclaim civilization. There was some distant shouting from the direction I came, more volunteers pouring into the woods. The sound of the other men and women drew the animal's attention. Its eyes flicked warily to the space over my shoulder. Then it turned and ran away. My judgment came and went that quickly. I don't know how long I lingered there, but I do know that another hiker broke my trance when they placed a palm on my shoulder. I muttered some nonsensical excuse and left the woods, porous and red. When I look at the rock that I carried home, I can't help but remember that creature. Was I as close to death as I felt? What sort of animal could that have been? I'll go back to Hamilton next year. It might be stupid, but I live in New Jersey, remember? Whatever that thing was, it didn't kill me then. Maybe I'll keep my distance when it comes to those woods. But I've got too many problems here in the city to just give up on my blueberry summers. Back in my 20s, I worked as a tree planter up in Flathead County in Montana. It's the hardest job I've ever had. You have to hike over a lot of uneven ground carrying 30 to 40 pounds of trees hanging in bags off your hips. And you have to bend down to plant them over and over. It's not that uncommon to have forest fires flare up when you're out planting. Some areas are so dry that anything can set them off. Even a spark from one of our shovels hitting a rock could be a concern. You just couldn't be too careful. One season, it had been extremely hot and dry, and there had been a fire ban for weeks. I was out planting on my assigned patch of land when another tree planter rushed over to me, waving his arms. I usually had my headphones on, which wasn't the smartest thing to do. I know, but it made the time go faster. I really should have been more alert and listening to wildlife and things. My music was cranked up and I had been focused on my work, which means looking down a lot. My coworker had been sent to get my attention because I hadn't realized what was happening around me. There were 8 to 12 people on our crew. We were each assigned our own block of wilderness to work. I was just zoning out in my own area. A fire had sparked up, and I hadn't even realized it. I had kind of noticed that it was hazy, but I had dismissed it as fog that hadn't burned off all the way yet. I remember I had also caught a glimpse of clouds I'd thought were rain clouds, but now I realized it was smoke. I realized that day that you don't always see smoke if you're not looking for it. My coworker told me we were getting surrounded by a fire that had sprung up suddenly. I should mention this was a helicopter job, which means that a helicopter picks up your crew in the morning. They fly you in and drop you in the middle of the area being reforested. You're just kind of in the middle of nowhere. You only have whatever you strap to your pack for the day. It turned out that other crews were on other blocks which were about to catch fire too. No one expected it. The fire just started and the wind was high. Me and the guy who found me met up with our foreman and raced off to find the rest of our crew. Your crew becomes your family and we would get everyone out or die trying. Our foreman was trying to contact a chopper to get us out as soon as possible. There were only 3 choppers for the whole camp. There were probably about a dozen crews working out there, so almost 150 people to be evacuated. There were only about 6 seats available for people on each chopper. It was scary to contemplate. It meant that the project manager and foreman had to decide who got out and when. That meant a lot of trying to get accurate information from scared people in the field who know they may not get out if they aren't prioritized. We just focused on finding the rest of our crew. Like me, most hadn't figured out what was happening. Every planter we'd get, we would split off to find the next planter. It was a lot of ground to cover, and you had to keep your head on straight. It was important to work fast, but getting injured by being in a big hurry would put you and everyone else at a huge risk. We finally managed to get the whole crew grouped together with the foreman. Everyone was all right, except for the threat of the fire, obviously. We got the okay to go to the clearing where the helicopter would land. We were heading that way and I was at the back of the line. That's when I heard the horrible yelping sound, like an animal in pain. I looked back and couldn't believe my eyes. My first thought was that it was a bear. There was a huge creature lumbering out of the forest screaming. It sounded almost human. It was covered in reddish-brown hair and incredibly tall. It was way too tall to be a bear. If anything, it looked way more like an ape. I screamed and everybody else looked back. Then everybody was yelling, "Oh my God," and running like hell toward the helicopter. We all managed to climb into the copter while the creature kept running toward us and screaming at the top of its lungs. We lifted up just when it reached the clearing. I'll never forget looking down into that creature's face as we left the ground. It had these beady black eyes that I swear were looking right at me. I couldn't tell if it was scared or angry. I felt terrible leaving it there. What if it was asking for help? But what could we do, you know? It might have wanted to harm us, and there's no way we could have fitted on that copter. It was like 8 feet tall. It had these huge shoulders and chest. But still, I feel guilty to this day. I really hope that it didn't get caught in the fire. All the people on the mountain made it out okay. A few weeks later, we came back to finish planting the blocks that we'd abandoned because of the fire. Parts of the forest had gotten scorched and parts were untouched. It felt strange to be back. I was definitely looking out for signs of that beast. I didn't see anything unusual. When our foreman had made the report, he'd made it sound like we saw something resembling a bear. But we had all seen it, and we knew better. So, I've got a story for you. Let me tell you about the night that'll forever be etched in my mind. It was a dark, chilly night in the small town where I grew up in Michigan. The kind of night that just feels strange. It all happened a couple of years ago, but it's still as clear as day to me. It was the summer of 2019, and the whole town was buzzing about some sightings of a creature that no one could identify. People talked, but I never really believed in all that mumbo-jumbo I was hearing about, it being some strange hybrid thing. That is, until the night of July 15th, when my buddies dared me to spend the night at the old Marshall farm. They picked the farm because it was said to be a hotspot for the creature. That's when things took a turn I'll never forget. The Marshall farm was an abandoned farmhouse located right at the edge of the woods, where the trees loomed tall and cast long, strange shadows. The place was old and rickety, and you could hear the creaking of the weathered wood. The air was thick there with the scent of damp earth, and the wind whispered in a way that made the place very creepy. So I was settling down at the farm, flashlight in hand and magazine ready to distract me. It was kind of exciting at first, being out there all alone, testing my courage and all. But then, things started to change. The wind was rustling the leaves in a weird way, not like normal. It was making a sort of melody. I then started to almost hallucinate that it was trying to tell me something. Then that low growl started. Yeah, it started far away, almost like a whisper, but it was persistent, growing louder and more unsettling with each passing minute. As I ventured outside to investigate, I noticed something else. There were tracks, big ones, leading right up to the edge of the woods. Not human tracks, not animal tracks I recognized either. The soil was upturned like something heavy and awkward had stomped through and messed up the grass. It made my skin crawl. And the smell, I can't forget that smell. It was this musky, damp scent that didn't belong to those woods. It wasn't the pleasant, earthy smell you get after a rain. No, this was different, like something wild and untamed. Then, there was the temperature drop. It got cold, real cold, like a chill settling over the whole place. Even though it was summer, I was suddenly shivering like it was the dead of winter. I started to feel watched too. You know that feeling you get when you think someone's looking at you, but you can't quite see them? That's what it was like. I kept looking over my shoulder, eyes darting around, expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Not yet anyway. And those sounds kept getting closer, like something was on the move. The growl, the rustling, the odd creaking that seemed to come from all directions. I even thought I heard a distant splash, like something wading through a swamp, which I couldn't figure out at all. All these things, they were like clues, like pieces of a puzzle that I didn't really want to solve. But they were there, and they were real, and they were leading me towards something I never thought I'd face. So yeah, there were signs, clear as day if you paid attention. It's just, at the time, I didn't really know what they meant. It was all a game, a dare, until it wasn't. Until it became something much, much more. Eventually it was midnight and I was back inside. The moon was out, but the clouds kept playing games, sometimes hiding it, sometimes letting it shine down like a spotlight on a stage. And me? I was the unwilling audience. So I'd been hearing those noises for hours, and they were getting closer. I was now starting to sweat, heart pounding in my ears, even though the night was now cool. I decided to peek out the window, thinking maybe I'd catch a glimpse of a deer or something ordinary. Boy, was I wrong. The first thing I saw were those eyes. They were yellow, piercing, and evil. Not animal eyes, not human eyes, something in between. And they were staring right at me, like they could see through the walls. The creature was standing there at the edge of the clearing, where the trees gave way to the moonlit grass. It was tall, impossibly tall, like 8 feet or something. It was standing upright, but its body was moving all awkward, like as if it didn't really know how to walk on 2 legs. Or maybe it just wasn't used to it. And I'll never forget that face. It was like an alligator or maybe a crocodile with scales and ridges, but somehow more terrifying. It was like it was sizing me up, deciding on how to deal with me. I ducked away from the window, heart hammering, afraid to breathe. The creature lingered for what felt like an eternity, shuffling around, sniffing the air like it was tracking something. I could hear it too, the heavy footfalls as it moved, the sound of its ragged breathing, the low growls that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was paralyzed. I just watched through a crack in the curtains as it explored the area. It moved towards the old barn, inspecting it, then the water well, like it was searching for something or someone. It was intelligent, I could tell. It wasn't just some wild animal. It was thinking, planning, deciding. Finally, it turned and lumbered back into the woods, disappearing from sight. But the feeling, the dread, the terror, it didn't leave along with it. It hung in the air like a thick fog, reminding me that something was out there, something that didn't belong. I didn't sleep that night, and still I didn't leave the house until the sun was high in the sky. I just couldn't bring myself to go out. After that night, I told my friends, my family, even the local newspaper. Some believed me, but many just laughed it off. The sightings continued for a while, but a few days after my encounter, they stopped as suddenly as they began. The creature was never captured, never fully explained, and never seen again. The old Marshall farm stands still, but no one dares to go near it after dark. I've moved on, but the memories linger. Every time I close my eyes, I see those yellow, piercing eyes looking back at me. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that low growl, a reminder of the summer when the legend became real for me. So there you have it, the true story of the night I encountered something I still can't fully explain. Believe it or not, I don't care. It's up to you. But be careful out there, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows. I had just started work as a police officer. I was new, and it takes a while for the other officers to start to have faith in us newbies. So when I think back on this event, I sometimes wonder if I was in over my head. I never really told the truth about what had happened, and neither did my partner at the time, whose name was Jeff. We didn't think we'd be believed. I hadn't earned my respect yet on the force, and my partner only had me as a witness to what happened. Do you think anyone would believe us? Absolutely not. If anything, my being there would have just made everyone more skeptical about our encounter. I wouldn't say that we covered it up. I would say that we didn't report what happened because we didn't fully believe what we had seen. What would you do in a situation like that? Probably the same as we did. I'm a little nervous to explain how things transpired. It's been so long, and I've never uttered a word about it since that night. But here goes. It was Halloween night. I was on duty, and most officers hated Halloween night because of all the mischief and drinking. Plus, the department saw Halloween night as a reason for people to create things in their mind, to let imaginations run amok and get themselves all riled up. So, of course, they sent the lower-ranking officers to deal with the situation. Jeff had been in the department for a longer time than I had, but hadn't moved up much. From what I was told, he had some trouble with drinking in the past. But from what I could see, he was very committed to the job, but also very worried about ruining his reputation further, so he tended to stick by the books. That night, we had been called out for several things. Firstly, for some rowdy teens who had been lighting trash cans on fire. Then there were a few bar fights. Stuff like that. Eventually, there was a call for loitering. Apparently, several people had called and stated that there was a strange man in a light-colored costume walking around one of the city's main streets. Many of the calls reported that the character hadn't done anything, but that it was very close to a residential area with kids, and that the person seemed a bit menacing. Probably just an odd bird, but with being near kids, I could understand the concerning nature of this. We were driving to the location, and the area was pretty dark. There were lots of trees, and even though it was near a residential neighborhood, this particular area looked very unkempt and far from any houses. Really, it reminded me of this wooded area from my hometown where kids would sneak off to party. So I had it in my mind that we were looking for a drunk kid in costume. That seemed plausible. Or even a homeless man wandering around. Nothing seemed too unusual about it at first. Eventually, we get to an area with a concrete tunnel. I suppose bridge would be the correct term for it, as it was apparent that the tunnel acted more as an archway over a stream. At the top of this arched bridge was a looming figure in a light-colored outfit of some sort, obviously the person that people had been calling in about. I couldn't see the face because we were still quite a distance away from the individual, but I could tell it was most likely a man. They appeared to be wearing some type of jumpsuit that was very pale in color, and something on his head. Now, this could have been a hat, a mask, a hood. Really, I'm not sure what it was at this point. We didn't want the individual to make a run for it. So, we parked where we were, climbed out of the vehicle, and proceeded towards the bridge. The air was very cold, and it felt very dense and heavy. I wouldn't have admitted it then, but the hairs on my neck stood up straight, and I just felt a sense of tension. As we got closer to the bridge, the individual looked more like a silhouette. We no longer had the benefit of our headlights to light up the bridge, so I tried my flashlight. Strangely, it didn't work. Jeff tried his flashlight. Same situation. It wouldn't turn on. Jeff then calls out to the guy, "Hello, sir. How's your night going?" We were really thinking that the man would be intoxicated, so we were expecting some slurred response, but nothing. We were nearly at the base of the tunnel, so we were puzzled that the individual wasn't responsive. This can be an alarming situation because we can assess what state the individual is in. Did they need help? Could they not speak? We aren't sure about any of their circumstances, so we had to be prepared for anything. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" "This is a residential area. Do you live here?" I looked up at the shadow. I still couldn't tell what the man was wearing, but it did seem like it was weathered and dingy. "Sir, if you aren't going to respond to our questions, we will have to come up there with you." Still no response. Jeff looked at me and I looked at him. He then nodded, meaning that we needed to approach the man and get closer. So my partner goes to the left of the bridge, and I go to the right. We had to climb up a hill on both sides to get to the top area of the bridge in order to come at him from opposite directions. The hill was a bit damp. The night had been humid and foggy, so it was a bit slick. By the time we reached the top, my partner and I were looking at each other from across the bridge. The man was no longer there, no longer on the bridge. He had basically vanished. We approached the area where the man had been standing. We started looking for traces of anything that would tell us he was there, but there was nothing. Where could the guy have gone? The bridge was high, and jumping off wasn't exactly an option. Besides, there was no noise, no splash, no scream, nothing. My partner, Jeff, was now on the other side of the bridge, shining his flashlight here and there, his face twisted in confusion. I could see his breath in the cold, humid air. We both knew something wasn't right. We met again at the center of the bridge, looking down into the water below, but there was nothing to see. No sign of any person. We were baffled. "I don't like this," Jeff said with his voice just above a whisper. "This isn't normal." "You're telling me," I replied, feeling a chill that wasn't from the night air. "Maybe he climbed down somehow, or maybe there's a path we didn't see." We looked around some more, but there were no signs of any path, no signs of anyone climbing down. Everything was still, and the fog was starting to roll in, making everything feel even eerier. Eventually, we decided to head back to the car. What else could we do? We had to report it, but what were we going to say? That a man had just vanished into thin air. As we were climbing down the hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just fog, shadows, and that damp, earthy smell of the night. We got into the car, and Jeff was quiet. I could see he was shaken. I was too, but I didn't want to admit it. We'd been through a lot together, but this was different. This wasn't something we could explain away or laugh off later. We drove back to the station in silence, each lost in our thoughts. We made our report, but like I said earlier, we did tell the truth as we experienced it. We just said we couldn't find the person people had called in about. The chief just shook his head and told us to get some rest. That night, neither Jeff nor I could sleep. We kept going over it in our heads, trying to figure out what had happened. But there were no answers, no logical explanations. And you know what the craziest part is? A few days later, another call came in. Same bridge, same description of the man. But this time, when the officers arrived, the man was gone again. We never did find out what was going on up on that bridge. And to this day, I avoid it whenever I can. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that something otherworldly was going on there. Jeff feels the same way. It's become a story we share with new recruits, a kind of initiation. They never know whether to believe us or not, but I tell you, it's the God's honest truth. That Halloween night on the bridge changed something in both of us. We saw something we can't explain, and it's stuck with us ever since. That's the job, I guess. You never know what you're going to encounter. But that night, that was something else. It's a night neither of us will ever forget. I was a biology major, hoping to get into medical school. I'd applied to several programs and was waiting to hear back. Everyone told me that you always get rejected your first time, so I decided to get a job in my field to better my chances when I applied again. I did a couple of internships during my undergraduate studies and found I really enjoyed lab work. I got a job at a biology lab just outside of Phoenix doing grunt work. In fact, it was mostly janitorial despite being advertised otherwise. It took about 8 months, but I worked my way up from scrubbing floors to landing a respectable position in my field. By the end of it, I was studying the Zika virus. More specifically, its effects in pregnant lab mice. I'll spare you the details for all the squeamish people out there. I would like to say that all our lab mice were treated as humanely as possible. The affected offspring were euthanized before they were even born. They didn't suffer, and while this might not have been ideal, it was the best way to study the virus. But I digress. This isn't the reason I wrote in about my story. There was something else in the lab. Something that most of us working there had no idea about. I didn't even know the thing existed until the day it almost escaped. I had stayed late one night doing a mouse dissection. I know that sounds bad, but there really isn't any other way to study them. The mouse was dead. It had been humanely euthanized. I wasn't torturing it or anything. And I'd also like to say that we were allowed to stay late at the lab if needed. I wasn't there secretly. The lights were on in my area. It was totally obvious I was there. It was nearly 1 a.m., and I was finally beginning to pack up my things and shut everything down at my workstation when I heard the alarm go off. At first, I thought it was the fire alarm, but I quickly realized it was a contamination breach. The doors shut and locked automatically, and there wasn't anything I could do until the contamination was controlled. I sat back down at my chair and opened my phone. I tried texting my boss to see if she knew anything about the situation, or how long I was expected to be stuck in the biology lab, but I didn't receive any response. Luckily, there was a sink here with filtered water and a small fridge. While not ideal, I would be fine if I was stuck for a while. It was a good 45 minutes before I heard people out in the hallway. I banged on the door to let them know I was in there. Luckily, I got one of them to stop and talk to me. They wouldn't tell me what was going on, but said I wasn't in any danger, but I just had to sit tight while they dealt with the problem. My biggest fear was a virus or a chemical leak somewhere. I didn't want to get infected with whatever superbug they might be cooking up in there, or even worse, wind up with cancer in 15 years. The more I thought about it, the more my mind wandered, and I'll be honest, I was scared. I ended up putting on a Tyvek suit and a gas mask just in case. It was all that I had in the lab, but at least it was some barrier between me and whatever might be in the air. I sat there in my PPE for another hour, maybe 2 before anything substantial happened. Out of nowhere, I heard shots, like from a machine gun. If you've never heard gunfire from inside a building before, let me tell you, it is totally deafening. I'm surprised the windows didn't crack. It was that loud. I could hear people running in the halls at least. That's what it sounded like. I couldn't tell for certain because of the echoes of gunfire. It was like everything was muted after that. I took my mask off. Whatever the contamination was, it certainly wasn't any virus or chemical. I checked the door again. Still locked. Then everything went quiet for another 20, maybe 30 minutes. I'm not entirely sure. I settled back down into my chair, hoping that maybe I'd get out of there sometime before morning. Then, I heard something walking past the door. I hoped it was someone finally coming to let me out, so I went over to the door. I should mention that there are no windows in the lab I was locked in. The only window was a long, skinny, rectangular window on the door, so you could see into the hallway. I approached the window, expecting to see someone in PPE gear, or maybe a police officer, or security guard, but that isn't what was out there. I saw two amber eyes staring in at me. The height of the eyes was about right for a large man, but that isn't what I was looking at. Its face was covered in short gray hair, and it had this remarkable canine appearance. I mean, it literally looked like a wolf's face, but on a human-like body. The hair started to get longer at the sides of its face and neck, but I couldn't see much else past the door. I was trying to take in all the details, but I was also scared out of my mind. What I can tell you is that it had the face of a wolf and stood as tall as a human. It locked eyes with me, and I felt this chill run down my spine. Those eyes, they were intense, almost glowing with this otherworldly energy. It was like they were peering right into my soul. I was frozen, unable to look away. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the door handle. It was trying to open the door. My heart leaped into my throat, and I stumbled back, fumbling for my phone to call for help. But I was paralyzed by fear, my fingers barely able to dial the numbers. The sound of the door handle continued, more persistent now, and I knew I had to do something. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the door handle, praying that it would hold. The creature outside was getting more agitated, its growls louder and more ferocious. I panicked. I pulled the fire alarm, which managed to scare off the creature temporarily, but it also set the sprinkler system off. So now I was locked in a lab, with water spraying from the ceiling, and some sort of wolf creature wandering freely through the halls. I heard more gunfire over the sound of the fire alarm, and water spraying everywhere, and then silence. It was another hour before we were let out of the building, and sent home without any answers. My boss finally called me back and gave the excuse that it was a training drill gone awry. I knew she was lying, and I think she knew I knew she was lying, but we both also knew that she wasn't going to give me the real answer. Whatever happened that night, the only things I can say for certain is that they were keeping something in the lab that shouldn't have been. It got out, and likely was killed by whoever showed up to deal with it. Joshua Tree National Park hosts the full range of Southern California's arid beauty. The wonder of the state's desert biomes is what first encouraged me to begin working in the region as a member of the National Park Service. For a long time it was perfect, and then it wasn't. There's a stone in Joshua Tree that attracts tourists from all over the world. It's the size of a small building and the shape of a skull. Its massive hollowed-out eyes are permanently fixated on the dry expanse of the park. I love that stone. I think maybe it loves me too. I know that's a weird thing to say. My skin crawls when I commit those words to paper. I'm only asking you to hear me out because it might be true. If it isn't love, it's something equally strong. Normally, to get a view of Joshua's stone skull, you have to wade between pockets of tourists and wait in line just for the chance of a brief photo op. If you arrive particularly early or particularly late, sometimes the crowd is a little thinner. When you work the park like I did, you know to visit the stone before the sun rises or after it sets. It's prettier in the dark, illuminated by the stars and the luminous pollution of California's distant cities. I was already headed toward the stone when I found him on the side of the trail, the man that cost me everything. He was dressed in worn clothing that looked to be centuries old. His feet were bare, and his hair was long and knotted. He didn't speak to me. He didn't call out or signal for help. He stood upright and immobile right on the edge of the trail, waiting. "Hello?" I remember asking his name. "What are you doing out here?" The park had chased away the last of the tourists nearly an hour before. This man looked like he had just crawled in from the desert. When he made no effort to reply, I reached out to touch him. His body wasn't warm. It was the same cool, ambient temperature as the rest of the air around us. He was more of the desert. Still, there was no response. I turned away from him briefly to contact my peers over the radio. I repeated his description and requested an emergency transport. When I looked back, the man was gone. Only the outline of his feet lingered in the dirt. I searched for a trail, anything to lead me back to him. There was nothing. I was alone. Then there was a howl. Wolves weren't common in the park, at least not around the well-traveled areas. I looked for one anyway, scanning the horizon for any signs of a wild dog or coyote. The howl sounded canine at least. What I saw wasn't a dog at all. It was standing upright, long-limbed but definitely humanoid. It started far away, but even with the great distance between us, I could tell the creature was approaching 7 feet tall. It threw its head back and howled again. Its protruding nose and jaw became visible, framed by the faint glow on the horizon. I did what felt natural. I ran for my life. I didn't know where to go except toward the skull. I sprinted as quickly as I could, kicking up dust and debris all along the trail. I cut across the unmarked paths where I could, trampling the brush and undergrowth. I didn't risk a glance back, but I knew it was behind me. I could hear its claws slicing through the same stems and stalks that I was flattening with my boots. I could feel its deep, heavy breathing reverberating in my bones. I never thought my life would flash before my eyes, not in my line of work. Supervising tourist destinations isn't exactly the most dangerous of park ranger responsibilities. That night, I saw it all. I saw my 5th birthday and my father's funeral. I saw my partner and our child. It felt like I was running toward those moments, toward the idea of making more of those memories. But in reality, I was headed somewhere else. I was headed toward the skull, and finally its broad dome-shaped crown was overlooking my insignificant body as I ran across the desert. I could see its brow and its eye sockets, then the grooves that always looked a little too much like teeth. The skull isn't haunted, I know that. It isn't possessed. Those ideas make for great conversation when you're a one-time visitor to Joshua Tree, but none of the rumors are true. Maybe it is sacred though, somehow. Maybe it is a safe place. I ran up the hill surrounding the stone, and when I finally reached its base, I slipped. I crashed face first into the dirt and skidded to what I was sure would be my end. I weakly rolled onto my shoulder and looked back the way I'd come. The monster wasn't there. It wasn't breathing down my neck or raising a clawed hand to finish our chase. It wasn't circling the perimeter, waiting for the perfect time to strike. It was just gone, as if the skull had repelled it. I inched back toward the desert and found more footprints in the dirt. Bare human footprints. When my peers arrived, prepared to escort the stranger back to our medical facility, I was hysterical. I didn't know how to stop talking about what I'd seen, even as the days stretched into weeks. I was released from the service shortly after that, with instructions to consider my mental health. They cast me out and told me to keep quiet. That's why I'm talking. That's why I'm telling the story. There must be a reason they want to keep it secret, right? Someone doesn't want the world to know about the man in the desert. Someone doesn't want the world to know that the skull-shaped rock in Joshua Tree might actually be protecting us. I've got something that's been simmering in my mind for a good while, and I reckon it's time to spill the beans. My name's Earl, and for a good chunk of my life, I worked for the Forest Service up in the thick woods of Wisconsin. My job was mostly paperwork, sifting through reports and complaints from folks living around the forest. Now here's where things get interesting. I started noticing a peculiar trend in the reports. Folks kept mentioning sightings of this enormous creature that looked like a wolf, but get this, it walked on its hind legs like a person. The first couple of times I thought, someone's had one too many beers. But the reports kept piling up, each one more detailed than the last. I decided to start a separate folder for these reports, which I half-jokingly named Big Bad Wolf Chronicles. I noticed that most sightings were around the Old Millers Creek area, a place with a history of strange tales and legends. As the weeks turned into months, my curiosity grew. I found myself staying late, poring over maps and reports, trying to find some sort of pattern. I even started talking to some of the old-timers in town. One fella, Mr. Higgins, told me his granddad used to speak of a guardian spirit that took the form of a wolf to protect the sacred lands. I was torn between thinking there was a logical explanation and wondering if something more mystical was at play. I mean, I'm a man of science, but the sheer number of reports and the conviction in the folks' words made me question everything. One evening, I was chatting with one of the rangers, a sturdy guy named Jim, who'd spent more time in the woods than in town. I casually brought up the reports, expecting him to laugh it off. But he didn't. He went quiet, took a sip of his coffee, and said he'd heard the howls and seen the tracks. Tracks that looked like a giant wolf, but only 2 feet. I asked Jim if he'd take me to Miller's Creek. I had to see this place for myself. We set out early one morning, and the deeper we got into the woods, the quieter it seemed to get. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. We reached the creek and Jim pointed out the tracks. They were just like the report said. I looked around, half expecting to see this creature, but there was nothing. We didn't see the wolf creature that day or any day. Eventually, I moved on to a different job and left the town. But I never stopped wondering about those reports. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking through the old folder, which I kept as a reminder of the mysteries that are out there. I don't know if I believe in guardian spirits or wolf creatures, but I do believe that there are things in this world that go beyond our understanding. And maybe that's all right. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, to remind us that the world is bigger and wilder than the small piece we see every day. Thanks for letting me share this, Donovan. It feels good to get it out there, even if I never got the answers I was looking for. As an experienced hiker and passionate nature enthusiast, I've spent countless hours exploring the beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains. The breathtaking vistas, tranquil valleys, and hidden trails have always drawn me in, fueling my thirst for adventure and discovery. My love for the great outdoors has led me to develop skills in wildlife photography, seeking to capture the elusive wonders that call this vast wilderness their home. On that particular morning, the crisp autumn air invigorated my senses as I embarked on another solo expedition into the heart of the Smokies. The leaves had started to transform into a vivid tapestry of reds, oranges, and yellows, adding a vibrant backdrop to the landscape. I set out with a camera slung across my chest and a heart full of anticipation. Venturing beyond the popular tourist spots, I yearned to immerse myself in the lesser-known corners of the park. It was there that the untamed secrets of nature often revealed themselves to those willing to seek them out. My goal was to capture not only the grandeur of the landscapes, but also the intimate moments of the wildlife that remained hidden from casual observers. As I trekked along a remote trail, my eyes keenly scanned the surroundings, searching for any signs of movement or life. The forest seemed alive with whispers, the rustling leaves hinting at the presence of hidden creatures. The wilderness had a way of speaking to me, enticing me to unravel its mysteries one step at a time. Gradually, my senses became attuned to the subtleties of the environment. The stillness of the forest was interrupted by signs of disturbance. A broken branch here, an upturned rock there. Curiosity ignited within me, drawing me closer to the enigma that lay ahead, despite the faint trepidation that coursed through my veins. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. My heart leapt in my chest, and instinctively I froze, my eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Peering through the dense foliage, I caught a glimpse of a colossal figure partially concealed within the natural tapestry of the forest. My gaze locked with the creature's piercing, intelligent eyes. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with a robust build that emanated strength and grace. Its body was covered in coarse, dark hair, intermingled with patches of moss and leaves, camouflaging it perfectly within its surroundings. The creature's face, hidden behind an impressive beard, revealed an uncanny resemblance to our ancient human ancestors. A mixture of fear and awe coursed through me as time seemed to stand still. We regarded each other with a mutual curiosity, both recognizing the rarity of this encounter. The creature emitted a low rumbling sound. A vocalization conveyed a blend of warning and curiosity echoing through the silent forest. With deliberate grace, the creature took a step backward, retreating into the shadowy depths of the forest. Its movements, despite its imposing size, were surprisingly nimble and agile. And just like that, the enigmatic being disappeared into the wilderness, leaving me in a state of wonder, excitement, and a hunger for understanding, slowly emerging from the trance-like state induced by the encounter. I realized that my camera, which hung idly by my side throughout the encounter, had not captured a single image. And yet, I felt no regret. Some moments were meant to be experienced, treasured in the depths of one's memory rather than confined to a photograph. Since that unforgettable encounter, I've shared my story with fellow hikers, researchers, and enthusiasts. I've delved into the depths of ancient folklore and unexplained phenomena, seeking to unravel the secrets of the Great Smoky Mountains. Each retelling solidifies the reality of that encounter in my mind, sparking a renewed sense of wonder and reverence for the vast mysteries that remain hidden within nature's embrace. To this day, I cherish the memory of that extraordinary encounter. Was it an undiscovered creature? A relic from forgotten time? Or merely a figment of my imagination? The questions persist, weaving themselves into the fabric of my journey through the untamed beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains. I was a ranger in Yellowstone for about 18 years. I had retired and moved to the Pacific Northwest in 2016, but I still visit Yellowstone often and remain friends with many of my former colleagues. This encounter happened during the fall of 2008 near Canyon Village on the north side of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, right off the Grand Loop Road, Route 89. It was nighttime around 8 p.m. when my wife noticed something unusual while driving our car down Highway 89, heading towards West Thumb Geyser Basin, also located near Canyon Village. The area between Roosevelt Arch and West Thumb Geyser is very remote at night, with only 2 gas stations for light along the Grand Loop Road, one at each end approximately 10 miles apart from each other, in addition to small clusters of campgrounds. Anyway, as we're driving through the north entrance gate into Yellowstone National Park, we both saw a beige-colored 4-legged animal running alongside our vehicle next to an empty trailer hitch on the back of a blue pickup in front of us. The animal was keeping pace with our vehicle and ran like a dog or a coyote, but it was much larger than either one. I would estimate that it was at least the size of a German Shepherd, but it had a long snout, more like a coyote, and its fur also looked different than either a dog or a coyote's. From what we could see in the darkness, the creature's fur appeared to be coarse like that of a wolf. The most unusual thing about this animal is that it appeared to be running on its hind legs only, sort of like how a human would run, interchanging between 4 and 2 legs. It didn't seem to be using its front legs at all, at least for part of the time. It would also change, and it was running at a loping gait like wolves do when they run. Its front hind legs were longer than most quadrupeds would be, and we were both wondering why we had not seen this animal before since it was so large and we do travel through the area frequently. We never saw anything like it again after that night. Also, since I am an avid hunter of big game animals, I know what every animal in Yellowstone looks like, especially the 4-legged mammals and some birds. This creature wasn't any of those things. I don't know what this creature was, but whatever it may have been, my wife and I both agree that what we saw was a canine or wolf-like bipedal animal running alongside Highway 89 near Canyon Village during the fall of 2008. The fact that it could interchange between 4 legs and 2 legs at its own whim is impressive and terrifying. And I think what disturbs me most about the stories is that whatever animal we saw that evening clearly was not a natural inhabitant of Yellowstone National Park. Also, my father shared an interesting experience that coincides with what happened to me. He used to work as a park ranger in the early 1970s at Canyon Village in Yellowstone National Park. And one night, while working the night shift, he saw a very large bipedal animal cross in front of his patrol car that he simply could not identify. He described it as being similar to a human but much larger and covered in black shiny fur. This occurred in the same general area where I had my encounter. My father retired several years ago and moved to Florida. For a time, he did live in Cody, Wyoming, near Yellowstone National Park, and I've been thinking about sharing my experience with him and asking him if he remembers seeing anything similar during his time as a ranger. The other odd thing is that the year 2008 was also a strange year for Bigfoot sightings, all across Idaho, especially in places like West Idaho. There were also some unusual anomalies witnessed by my paranormal activist friends during this same time period. They say that it coincides with the 2008 crash. I don't know what to make of. Whatever we saw that evening, anyway, was not any kind of known animal from Yellowstone National Park or anywhere else for that matter. That's all there is to it. Thanks for listening, and I think this animal belongs in its own category. My name is John Collins, a scientist by day, but also a nature enthusiast with an insatiable curiosity for the mysteries that lie hidden within the natural world. I've always been drawn to the unexplored corners of our planet, seeking out remote and lesser-known areas. It was during one of my solo expeditions to the rugged forests of Northern California that I had an encounter that defied explanation. It was a warm summer day as I ventured into the depths of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Towering redwoods stood tall, casting dappled shadows upon the forest floor. The date was June 12, 2019, a day that would forever be etched in my memory. Guided by an unyielding curiosity, I ventured deep into the forest, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of wildlife. And then a peculiar sound reached my ears, a subtle rustling amidst the dense undergrowth. My heart quickened, sensing that something extraordinary awaited me. With cautious steps, I followed the source of the sound. Every fiber of my being was consumed by anticipation and an unexplainable thrill. And there, in a small sunlit clearing, I beheld a creature that defied every preconception I had. The creature stood before me, its body adorned in sleek charcoal gray fur that shimmered in the sunlight. It possessed a muscular frame, a blend of bear and ape, hinting at a predatory agility and strength. Its forelimbs were elongated, contributing to its slightly hunched posture, while the hind limbs appeared shorter in comparison. But it was the creature's face that held me captive, a convergence of human and animal features. Its prominent snout bore a striking resemblance to that of a bear, complete with a damp black nose. Yet, it was its eyes that held my gaze captive, piercing and wise, as if they carried the weight of millennia. Time seemed to freeze as we locked eyes, and a connection passed between us, unspoken and profound. It held no hostility or aggression, only an unspoken understanding that I was a respectful observer in its domain. The creature's rounded ears swiveled independently, attentive to its surroundings. Moving with a blend of grace and purpose, the creature exhibited a primal allure that awakened a mix of fear and reverence within me. Its presence embodied the fusion of animalistic power and ancient wisdom, a living embodiment of forgotten legends. My hands trembled as I attempted to capture the moment, desperate to preserve this surreal encounter. But the creature, as if sensing my limitations, chose to retreat into the depths of the forest. It vanished with a swiftness that left me spellbound, disappearing into the emerald embrace of the towering redwoods. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Yet the memory of that encounter lingered, etching itself into the very fabric of my being. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved deep into the annals of folklore and local legends. But despite all I found, skepticism prevailed, and few dared to believe in the existence of such a creature. Undeterred, I sought out experts in the field of cryptozoology, desperate for any lead that might shed light on the enigma I had witnessed. Some dismissed my account as mere fantasy, but a select few seasoned researchers shared tantalizing fragments of information. They spoke of a hidden realm, concealed within the depths of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, where cryptids roamed, veiled from prying eyes. The creature I had encountered was said to be a guardian of this realm, a sentinel charged with safeguarding its secrets from human intrusion. Though the world may dismiss my encounter as mere illusion, I carry the weight of truth within me. The creature I encountered in the remote forests of Northern California remains nameless, shrouded in the allure of the unseen. I stand as a witness to the delicate balance between belief and skepticism. We are but explorers, seekers of knowledge, forever on the precipice of unraveling the secrets that lie beyond our understanding. So let the skeptics scoff and the naysayers dismiss. I will continue to embrace the mysteries that nature presents, venturing into the unknown with reverence and an unyielding determination to uncover the veiled secrets that lie hidden within the redwoods of Northern California. I am a hunter. I've been hunting for years. I would consider myself experienced, but considerate. I keep to the seasons, abide by the rules and laws, and always safety first. I enjoy the thrill of the kill, but also hunt for food. If I shot a deer, I bring it home and feed the entire family. I'm telling you all this to let you know that I'm not some sort of gun-toting crazy that goes out killing for the sake of it. I've also been doing it for a long time. I'm well into my 50s now and began going out with my father when I was just a young teen. Again, this is just to let you know that I've seen many things, as you can imagine, out in the woods. So when I came across the animal I'm about to tell you about, I was confused, and I know that I wasn't mistaken. It was turkey season, so I was on early hoping to catch a big tom. I was looking to find somewhere to bunker down. It was around 5 in the morning or so, a touch of mist and still quite dark. There was a profound dampness in the air. Since I'd been in the woods many times, I knew the exact place I wanted to make a sort of base. I headed over to the spot that I'd used many times before, as it had awesome coverage with trees, and a sort of dip in the ground which seemed to almost be ready to lie and wade in. I headed over and I was certain that I was in the right spot. But something felt off, call it a gut feeling. Some sort of hunter's intuition, if you will. I can read a situation which has come in mighty handy many times before and kept me out of a couple of tight scrapes. That's what I felt now. That something wasn't right. As I said, it was still pretty dark since it was early dawn, and I was mostly feeling my way from memory than actually being guided by any sort of light. I don't take a flash or anything with me, so I hadn't seen what had decided to make my usual spot a home until I came closer. Thankfully, I heard before I saw, and what I heard made all the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Dogs. I could tell it was dogs from the low growl, whining and yapping, and those sounds were the most alarming as they seemed to be coming from a pup. Now anyone knows that the worst kind of animal to encounter is a mama. They will do anything to protect their offspring, and quite rightly so. I wasn't sure why there would be a pack of feral dogs in the woods. I had never seen anything like them in there before, but I now did not want to hang out. I was just about to try and sneak off when my cell phone began to vibrate. To say I was angry was an understatement. I always turn it off entirely before a hunt. I hoped the vibration alone wouldn't attract any unwanted attention, but of course it did. Again, I heard it before I saw it, that growling noise. Only there seemed to be something very, very wrong. I stood up. I'm over 6 feet tall. That sound should have been coming from at the very most, around the top of my leg area, yet it seemed like it was coming from right beside me. And in fact, I could swear that I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. My first instinct was to run, but I also know that sometimes running makes whatever's behind you give chase. I needed to turn to face this thing, show some human dominance. Yeah, right? But that's what was going through my mind. That and total blind panic. As I slowly turned, I came face to face with what I assumed was the mama dog, only she wasn't dog-sized. She was not wolf-sized. She was people-sized, huge, she-dog as big as me. Not like an actual hound on 4 legs that just happened to be massive. This thing was standing on 2 legs, looking me right in the eye. She was built like a pro wrestler covered in thick reddish-brown fur. Her head was reminiscent of that of a Doberman with those tight, mean-looking features. Her teeth were barred, and every tooth, unlike that of a regular dog, was pinpoint and tack sharp. Before I could even turn away, I wanted to run. I was scared out of my mind. I didn't even bother to draw my weapon or try anything to defend myself. I was that frightened right then that I honestly thought she was going to kill me, and I just wanted it to be quick and as pain-free as possible. Yes, my life flashed before my eyes right there and then. Then there was another sound, a tiny yip, a yelping noise. It was the pup, and it seemed to be gravitating towards its mother. The tiny pup, who when I got a quick look was actually the size of a small boy, saved my life as Mama seemed to think whatever the pup needed was more important than me, right at that moment. She quickly made her way back over to the nest, and I ran. I was no longer worried about whether she would give chase. I just hedged my bets. She was more protective than aggressive and wanted me away from her offspring rather than to eat me. Thank the Lord that bet paid off and I'm alive to tell you this story. I haven't been back to that spot. I don't necessarily have faith that it was a death wish, but I also have never told anybody about it. I know that Mama Dog Thing was aggressive. I was sure, 100 sure that I had it and was done for that night, but she was being protective. You don't mess with moms. Other hunters, though, they'd kill her and the baby wouldn't think anything of it. Just carry the bodies out and parade them around to share all over the internet. I might have been more scared than I hope I'll ever be again, but one thing is that I'm not cruel. The other thing is if that was a baby and a mama, there must have been a dad. And if Mama was that big, what was Daddy like? I hate to think about it. I'm a long-time listener of your show. I'm a hunting guide by profession based in Montana. Never thought I'd be writing in about something like this, but here we are. Last Tuesday, I was leading a group through the Gallatin National Forest. We were tracking elk. Nothing out of the ordinary for that day. Just going through the motions of explaining tracking signs and showing the group how to spot the fresh tracks and droppings. Around dusk, we started noticing a few odd things. Firstly, the forest was too quiet. Now, I've been in the woods enough to know that when it gets that quiet, something's not right. Then this stench hit us. Not just wet dog, but something else mixed in, like the smell of garbage that's been sitting in the hot sun with a weird hint of sulfur. We stumbled upon this creature next. I say stumbled upon because I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it myself. It was massive. I'd say somewhere between 7 to 9 feet tall. The moonlight made its black and brown fur glisten, muscles rippling under the skin as it moved. It had a hump on its back and a massive body that made me think of those bodybuilder types, all wide shoulders and big chest. But what really stuck with me was the face. It had a snout like a German shepherd, but broader, and I could see a double row of teeth, fangs really, that shone in the moonlight. The ears were pointy, reminded me of a Doberman pinscher. It had a demonic look to it, and the eyes. They were the worst part, glowing faintly in the dark. The encounter felt surreal, like something out of a horror movie. I've been hunting for the better part of 3 decades, Donovan, but this thing scared me. I felt a cold rush of fear, my heart pounding in my chest like a jackhammer. The creature seemed to be as surprised to see us as we were to see it. It let out this low guttural growl before it took off into the woods. It didn't run like an animal would. It stood upright on its hind legs just like a man. After the creature disappeared, we all just stood there for a moment, shell-shocked. We quickly packed up and left the area. On the way back, nobody talked much. The encounter left us all with a feeling of unease. We got back to town around midnight. Next day, I returned to the area with a few of the local guys. I felt obligated to, in case this thing was a threat to folks around here. The smell was gone by then, but we could see clear signs where it had been broken branches, disturbed ground. As professionals, we couldn't help but inspect its tracks. The footprints were like nothing we'd seen before. They looked somewhat like a dog's, but were far too large. And there was a clear bipedal pattern. They were scattered around the area, too randomly for my liking. It didn't feel like the creature was scared or fleeing, more like it was curious and observing us. The tracks led to a dead elk nearby. It was ripped apart, and the smell of blood was overwhelming. The way it was killed, it seemed more savage than any natural predator I've come across. The scene was brutal, as if something had played with its food. Everyone was quiet on the way back. There's a tension in town now. People are scared, and with good reason. This isn't a ghost story or some urban legend. It's real. It's here in our backwoods. I thought your audience might want to hear about this. This isn't just for the thrill of the story, but also as a caution for those in the area or planning a trip here soon. The woods are a beautiful place, but they're also wild. And sometimes they remind us just how wild they can be. I'm Sam, a geologist surveying in the remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. We were out here drilling for core samples to analyze the positioning of the strata of the region. It was late because we'd been working in the evening to avoid the heat of the day. While I was operating the drill, I started to pick up on something out of place. The smell. It was a sulfurous scent, like a struck match or a rotten egg. At first, I wondered if the drill had hit something in the earth. But there was something else too, a noise. Not mechanical or geological, but animalistic. A low rumble that you actually felt more than you heard. It was too quiet to be thunder, too resonant to be the machinery. The sound was persistent, almost rhythmic, like the pulse of a massive heart buried deep in the earth. As I tuned into it, it became clearer, a resonant growl, fluctuating in pitch, that occasionally pierced through the hum of our equipment. The rumble, originating from somewhere within the darkness, felt foreboding and unnatural. Each time the sound rippled through the air, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, a nagging feeling that we were not alone. Then I saw it. Against the backdrop of the dense forest, a creature was silhouetted. Its height varied, I'd say, between 6 to 10 feet. It seemed to shift somehow, as if it were contorting or changing shape. Its body was an unusual mix of features. I saw bat-like wings fold and stretch, and what looked like the head of a goat. There was something oddly reptilian about its body, though. I'd say it was brown or black, but the low light made it hard to be sure. The creature, although still shrouded in shadow, had a grotesque appearance that was a bizarre mix of animals. The wings were undoubtedly bat-like, appearing both leathery and solid. They tucked and folded against its body in a way that reminded me of how a bird shields itself from the cold. The head of the creature was a complete anomaly. With the profile of a goat, it appeared almost common, but the devilish twist in its features was far from ordinary. Its eyes, a piercing yellow, glowed like the beam of a flashlight cutting through the dark, focused and unyielding. Then there was the body, which I could now see a bit better scaled like a reptile. It glistened in the low light, reflecting an almost oily sheen. It was elongated and powerful, a contradiction to the typical form of a mammal or bird, but in sync with the abnormality of this beast. Its color, somewhere in the range of deep brown to black, gave it an added layer of menace, enabling it to blend effortlessly into the dark. It was clear this creature was adapted to its environment, a deadly predator lurking in the shadows. The sight of this thing, it gave me chills. Not just from fear though, there was plenty of that. More like a sense of profound unease, as if I was looking at something that simply shouldn't exist. Every instinct in my body screamed at me that this creature didn't belong here, or anywhere in the natural world I was familiar with. Yet there it was, real as anything else in that forest. Finally, it emitted a strange sound, a sort of roar, but I can't really describe it. Then it launched itself into the air, and with a gust of wind and a rustling of leaves, it was gone. After it left, I shut everything down, packed up as quickly as I could, and told everyone we had to get out of there. We were done for the day. Back at the base camp, I wrestled with how to convey what I had seen. I was met with skepticism, understandably. Their laughter was nervous, the kind that fills an uncomfortable silence when people don't know what to believe. A few exchanged glances as if questioning my sanity. But there was also an undercurrent of apprehension. I could tell some of them were unnerved by the conviction in my voice, the detail in my story. I didn't expect them to believe me right away, but the doubt on their faces added another layer of unease to the already surreal encounter. It's one thing to experience something like this alone. It's another to confront the disbelief of your peers, realizing that your experience has isolated you in some ways. As days passed, an unspoken agreement seemed to take hold. We avoided discussing the incident. There was a change in our routines. People stayed closer to the base after dark. The evening chatter was subdued, and there was an undeniable tension that lingered in the air. Even without any confirmation or validation, the group had been affected in some way by the encounter. It seemed to stir an instinctual unease in all of us, a primal part of our brains recognizing something inherently other. Since then, I've done a bit of research, trying to find any local legends or reports of similar encounters. I found a few here and there, but nothing concrete. It's unsettling, not knowing what I saw, but I'm sure of one thing: I won't be returning to that drilling site anytime soon. My name's Jake. I'm an avid hiker from Oregon and a fan of your show. I thought I'd share something with you that happened to me a couple of weeks ago while hiking in the Cascade Range. You might find it interesting for your program. I was in the Cascades on a solo trip. I wanted to spend some time alone with nature and figured there's no better place to do so than the Oregon wilderness. I was on my third day of hiking, aiming to reach a remote alpine lake that I'd heard was particularly beautiful this time of year. It was late afternoon when I first noticed something unusual. I was navigating a steep trail, still a good hour from the lake, when I heard an unfamiliar noise echoing through the trees. It was a low growl that didn't match anything I've heard in the wild. My first thought was a bear, but it didn't sound right. Too deep, too guttural. A sudden foul stench hit me next. A mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't quite place. A sulfurous smell. My heart started racing and I knew instantly something was off. I've seen my share of wildlife in my time, but this was different, almost unsettling. And then I saw it, Donovan. At first, I thought my eye were playing tricks on me. But as my vision focused, I could clearly see this massive creature standing upright about 50 yards away. It was tall, around 8 feet by my guess, with a massive body that looked like it belonged to a bodybuilder. I noticed a thick, dark mane around its neck and shoulders, resembling a cape draped over its wide shoulders. Its legs were thick and muscular, like those of a dog, yet they ended in what looked like human feet. The creature's face was partially hidden by the shadow of the trees, but I could make out a long, broad snout and 2 pointy ears that looked similar to a German shepherd's. It let out another guttural growl. Despite the fear, I was entranced. It was terrifying yet fascinating. The wilderness had always been a source of peace for me, but in that moment, I felt fear. I also felt a strange sense of wonder, The kind you feel when confronted by something utterly foreign, something that challenges your understanding of the world. Still trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I instinctively reached for my phone to take a photo. But the creature's ears twitched and it quickly turned its head towards me, revealing a face that was eerily dog-like, yet somehow monstrous. The snout was broad and looked almost like that of a Doberman pinscher, while the mouth revealed a double row of teeth and terrifyingly large fangs. Its eyes were not visible in the shadow, adding to its unnerving presence. With a realization that felt like a punch in the gut, I remembered the sounds I'd heard earlier. That low, guttural growl must have come from this creature. I was on its turf now. All my years of hiking and outdoor experience seemed to pale in the face of this unknown entity. Suddenly, the creature let out a howl, a sound so haunting and eerie it still gives me chills to think about. It was nothing like a typical wolf's howl. There was something almost human about it. I was frozen in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. The stench of rotting meat and sulfur was even stronger now, and it took all my willpower to keep myself from gagging. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the creature looked at me and then, surprisingly, turned and disappeared into the dense forest, its huge humped back and wide shoulders visible until the trees swallowed it. It didn't run, didn't seem scared. Rather, it moved with a strange grace, like it had all the time in the world. Once it was out of sight, I stood still, listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath along with me. After what seemed like an eternity, the silence was broken only by the distant chirping of birds. It was over, but I was left with a pounding heart and shaking legs. After the encounter, I was in shock for a while, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I quickly packed up and made my way back to my camp, every little sound making me jump. I stayed awake all night, startled by every noise, half expecting the creature to return. But it didn't. Once I was out of the woods and back to civilization, I tried to research what I had seen. I found tales of mythical creatures, folklore, but nothing that really matched what I had encountered. I've also reached out to local wildlife experts, but so far no one can explain it. It's like nothing anyone's heard of around these parts. I still hike, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm out there in the wilderness. The world feels a little different, a little less familiar now. I hope sharing my experience might help me and maybe others who've had similar encounters feel less alone. My story is quick, but I wanted to share it with you anyway. Ever since I was a small boy, I would often go hunting with my father outside of New Orleans in the swamps. One night we were looking for game when my father found an alligator. It began to approach and my dad took a shot at it, killing it on the spot. He shot it right between the eyes. We went over to look closer when suddenly, from the bushes, this crazy man-sized lizard appeared. It was dark in color, had big orange eyes reminiscent of a cat, and reeked of decaying meat. My father instantly started shaking as he slowly started to raise his shotgun. This pterodactyl-looking thing stared at us and began to move quickly towards us. That's when we realized it was actually moving towards the dead alligator. My father aimed at it, pulling the trigger, but the shotgun jammed. Suddenly, we heard something behind us. We realized there were more of these things walking towards us from a distance. The one in front had now picked up the dead alligator and began tearing its skull open, eating it right in front of us. We stood there in shock. It reminded me of something that had torn a turtle open, eating the fresh meat. The one behind us gained distance quickly, leaping and knocking my father over. I ran as fast as I could, hoping it wouldn't chase me and leave us alone, even though this thing had scratched me while leaping over. These things let my father go. They were preoccupied with a dead alligator. My dad came running up behind me while these things stole his kill, then disappearing into the swamp. I don't know what they were, but I sure hope nobody ever has to experience such a thing like that again. The weird thing is, this happened in the 1980s, right around the same time that a boy from Skateboard Swamp saw that strange reptilian being running after him. I have no idea if they're the same thing or not, but wanted to share my side of it with you. Dear Donovan, my name is Jack and I'm a bridge welder by trade. You might be wondering why a guy who spends his days working on bridges is writing to a show host about mythical creatures. Well, even welders need hobbies, right? Mine happens to be hiking. It's a welcome break from the welding mask and torch, and I get to enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. Last weekend, I decided to take a solo trip through the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. I was halfway through my usual trail, savoring the feeling of the earth beneath my boots and the sound of leaves crunching when I noticed something was off. The usual woodland noises, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves were replaced by an eerie silence. That's when I smelled it. Sulfur. A strong, nauseating scent that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was as though someone had lit a pile of rotten eggs on fire right in the middle of the forest. I've been hiking for years, and let me tell you that smell isn't normal. And then I saw it. Standing a distance away, in a clearing was this creature, a thing straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, easily reaching 8 feet tall, and its body was a bizarre mix that reminded me of a lizard and a goat, with bat-like wings folded at its sides. Its skin was brown and scaly, like the rusted beams I often repair. The face, though, it was terrifying, glowing yellow eyes boring into mine. It looked oddly like a horse, yet twisted into something monstrous. A long tongue flicked out of a mouth filled with sharp teeth. In the way it looked at me, there was an intelligence there that made my skin crawl. The creature didn't just stand there. It moved, revealing more of its bizarre appearance. Its black skeletal body stretched grotesquely as it unfurled its wings. They weren't exactly bat-like as I initially thought, more dragon-like, leathery and huge, casting an ominous shadow on the forest floor. The thing's legs were hocked, similar to a goat's but with an eerie skeletal thinness to them. The creature's long tail whipped restlessly behind it, moving with a strange agility that contradicted its otherwise ungainly appearance. And atop its terrifying face, 2 horns protruded. They were twisted and dark as if scorched, adding to its demonic aura. Its eyes continued to glow a chilling yellow that seemed to pierce through the semi-darkness of the forest. And every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of its long tongue darting out, flicking through the air as if tasting it. But what was truly bone-chilling was when it made a sound. A low rumble echoed through the clearing, almost like a growl, but with an unnatural resonance. The kind of sound you'd expect to come from a creature of nightmares, not something standing in front of you in the flesh. The encounter didn't last long after that. It seemed to lose interest in me, those glowing eyes shifting away. With one powerful leap, it was airborne, those monstrous wings beating against the air and causing a rush of wind that nearly knocked me off my feet. The last I saw was a silhouette disappearing into the darkening sky, leaving nothing but the sulfurous smell and the haunting memory behind. After the creature flew off, I was left in a state of disarray. With my heart still hammering in my chest, I began the hasty trek back towards civilization. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. As a bridge welder, I'm used to finding solutions to structural problems. But this was beyond any logic or understanding I was equipped with. Once I reached my truck, I found my hands were still shaking. I sat there for a while, the scent of sulfur lingering in my nostrils, replaying the encounter in my mind. Eventually, I turned the key in the ignition and began the drive home, the image of the creature's glowing yellow eyes etched in my memory. Over the following days, I tried to go about my daily routine. The sound of welding filled the days and gave me a sense of normalcy. Yet, every now and then I'd find my thoughts drifting back to the creature. The smell of sulfur seemed to follow me too, no matter how many showers I took or how many times I washed my clothes. I did some research thinking I'd stumbled upon a yet undiscovered animal, maybe even a new species. The more I read, the more I came across tales of the Jersey Devil. Every description I read matched what I'd seen: the lizard goat body, the horse-like face, the sulfurous smell. I'd always dismissed such tales as folklore, but there was no denying the uncanny similarities. I've even returned to the Pine Barrens a couple of times since then, drawn by a need for answers. I didn't see the creature again, but I did find strange tracks and once again encountered that awful sulfur smell. And it's not just me, other hikers have reported similar sightings and smells in the same area. My hope in writing to you, Donovan, is not only to share my encounter, but to find some answers. Maybe your show can shine a light on this. Bring in experts. Help me and others understand what we've experienced. My old house used to sit in a nice rural area in Ohio. It was a nice, tranquil area surrounded by trees, nature, and wildlife. It was about 10 miles away from Canton, if you know where that is. It was definitely a small town vibe where everybody knew each other's name and secrets were hard to keep. There was a local reservoir that I would frequently catch catfish in. It was a really cool place, and since there wasn't much else for a young boy to do in my town, I pretty much spent every single day fishing at the reservoir. Life was simple back then, but things changed when I saw something I would never forget in that reservoir. I was spending the evening with my friends Kyle and Lenny. We were exploring the nooks and corners of our hometown. Eventually, of course, we all decided to head to the reservoir. We'd made our way to the swampy shores, hoping to catch a catfish or two, but what we found was not a catfish at all. It was something different. As we edged closer to the water, a creepy figure emerged from the dark, rippling surface. It was taller than any of us, reaching almost 7 feet. It had an unusual humanoid appearance, but with no arms in sight, a sight so surreal it seemed like it was pulled from a science fiction movie. In our shock, we tried to make sense of what we saw. Green, glowing eyes gleamed ominously in the murky darkness, and its feet, webbed and large, made a squishing sound as the thing tread across the swampy ground. Was it an escaped experiment? A cruel joke someone was playing on us? Or was it something inexplainable by anyone? Petrified, we could only stare as the creature moved toward us. Lenny, the bravest amongst us, stood his ground, not taking his eyes off the luminescent green orbs that stared right back at us. The creature stopped momentarily as if studying us before moving again. This time, its direction was clear. It was moving towards Lenny. Lenny, move. I remember yelling, but it was as if he was under some sort of trance. He just stood there, captivated by the creature's glowing eyes. Before any of us could react, the creature was inches away from Lenny. The eerie silence was broken by a soft, squelching sound as the creature extended what could have been its mouth. In a moment of sheer panic, Kyle and I lunged forward, grabbing Lenny by his arms and pulling him away. We didn't stick around to see what the creature did next. Adrenaline pumping, we ran as fast as we could, leaving behind the chilling, squelching sounds and the glow of green eyes. That night, none of us could sleep. We were haunted by what we'd seen, by the creature that had almost gotten Lenny. It was clear to us that what we encountered was no ordinary creature. The next day, we returned to the reservoir reluctantly. We wanted answers. We found large, webbed footprints, exactly where we'd seen the creature emerge from the water. A chilling reminder of our encounter. We quickly decided to report this to the local police. I'll never forget the skeptical look on the sheriff's face as we narrated our experience. He humored us, visiting the reservoir to investigate, but his skepticism faded when we saw the footprints. Even he couldn't dismiss the tangible evidence right in front of him. Though we continued to fish at the reservoir, things were never the same. Every ripple in the water would send shivers down our spines. We'd laugh it off, joking about the lake monster, but the humor was tinged with a sense of underlying fear. As for Lenny, he's never been quite the same. He's quieter, more reserved. He was no longer the bravest amongst us, and there was a wariness in his eyes, a caution that wasn't there before. We never talk about that night. It became a silent pact between us. But the memory remains, etched into our minds, a chilling reminder of the day the Charles Mill Lake monster almost got Lenny. But life has a strange way of unfolding. I eventually moved away. They were back once a year or so to visit family. So one cold winter night a few years ago, I found myself back at the reservoir. It was not a planned visit, but a spontaneous drive that led me there. Everything was just as I remembered. The cool breeze, the eerie silence, and the dark water surface. As I stood on the edge of the reservoir staring into its dark depths, I realized that the encounter with the monster had left a deeper mark on me than I initially thought. It wasn't just a memory of fear. It was a lesson, a harsh one, that humbled me and shaped me into the person I had ultimately become. My encounter with the creature was a reminder of our insignificance and the infinite mysteries that our universe holds. Even today, the thought of that strange, horrid creature sends chills down my spine. But I know I'll never be able to shake it. That monster is a part of my story, a part of who I am, and I'll never be able to shake it. Let me start off by saying that I am someone who loves to camp. I've been all around, and throughout my entire life, I've never had an interaction with an animal that frightened me, even in the least. That is how I know that the thing I'm going to tell you about is no animal. My sister and I decided that for a summer trip around 5 years ago, we would go backpack camping all across the Great Plains area of the US. We hit all the best spots: Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and the like. Finally, we were in Colorado. I wanted to stay in Colorado for a while because it's always been my favorite. It's gorgeous there. We found an amazing campground to station ourselves in for the next week or so and set up shop. We got to explore, and we were having a blast, hiking all around this really scenic mountain area. Then, on about our third day, when the sun started to set, we began making our way back to the campsite. But on the way there, we got a bit distracted. As we were hiking, we stopped to drink some water and eat a protein bar, when all of a sudden, out of basically nowhere, the whole area reeked. It smelled like garbage at first, but as we sat there a bit, it started to smell worse than that. It was like rotting flesh all around us. I made sure my sister noticed too, that I wasn't going crazy, but obviously neither of us knew what it could be. We thought maybe a skunk, but we knew those weren't really native to the area. Our next guess was a dead animal or something. And while we didn't care so much about that, we were a bit worried something bigger was going to come by and eat it. Or worse, something bigger already did eat it, and now we were in its way. We finished eating, agreed that we would go in the opposite direction back to the site, but then completely stopped in our tracks. Ahead of us, several yards, luckily what I thought to be a safe enough distance, there was this figure. I don't really know how else to describe it, other than a figure. As I said, it was getting dark, and I didn't really get to see any details of what this thing looked like other than its general shadow. And it was a big shadow. A big shadow that had these insanely huge antlers. So now I'm thinking, what is this? A big elk? A moose? My sister and I are just staring at it. Then she has the bright idea of actually wanting to approach it. I stopped her and instead suggested we yell at it or to it, or something else first. So we both call out a pretty basic hello to the thing, and it's quiet for a few moments. Then things got really scary. The voice of a little girl, clear as day, shoots back, "Hi, can you help me?" We both absolutely flip out because the thing we are looking at is not only definitely not a little girl, and arguably, it's not even human. Maybe if we had heard that voice call out earlier, when we couldn't see anything, it might have tricked us. But we were staring at this giant beast and hearing a little girl's voice come out of it. It was disgusting and horrifying. And even as I sit here now looking back on the whole thing, it didn't even sound that much like a real little girl. It sounded like someone trying their best to mimic the voice of a little girl, Like it was a recording maybe, or some kind of really convincing impression. But to this day, I know for sure that the voice wasn't authentic. Then, like it almost noticed we weren't falling for it, the thing's eyes start to glow. This is the bit of the story where people will usually roll their eyes. Tell me that I'm just trying to be funny, but I kid you not. The eyes of this thing start to dimly glow yellow, and next thing we knew, it was gone. It literally disappeared. We were both obviously quite shaken up by this whole thing. Whatever this creature was, not only was it trying to lure us towards it, but it was massive, had horns, and reeked to a degree that was nearly unbearable. This whole thing was now feeling supernatural or something. Anyway, we instantly realized that approaching it was absolutely the wrong choice. We slowly retreated and made our way back to the campsite and said, screw it. It's already past dark. If we stay here, we're probably safer than if we take the several-mile hike through the wilderness to get back to the car. I can't lie. I don't think either of us slept a wink that night. It was crazy. I mean, what the hell was that thing? But then, of course, that wasn't even the last of it. The next morning, right? We get up, we start packing up all of our stuff, and lo and behold, just as we're about to get the hell out of there, the smell is back. That nostril-burning stench of rot was just all around us, just like the night before. I'm a little freaked out, but I also didn't know if the smell was necessarily related to the thing we saw. After we finished gathering our things, cautiously of course, and I'm looking around like a crazy person for any signs of something off. I didn't want anything freaky to happen again, so I was on high alert. I heard a few noises, but ultimately nothing else happened, and we were fine. Everything turned out okay in the end. We were able to get back to the car safely, and there was no sign of the creature again, aside from the nasty smell. However, there was one little thing that creeped me out. Back at the campsite, there was a deer that stood a short distance away, that was staring at us as we finished packing. For a moment, I thought maybe the smell was coming from the deer, but I obviously can't be sure. All I do know is that the deer was very intently watching us put our stuff away, and even followed us a bit as we made our way out the area. My sister thought the deer was cute, but I had a strange feeling about it, like something was off, like it knew how to think or something. Anyway, I don't know for sure, but that's my tale. Thank you for listening, as it's definitely something that has stuck with me for a long time. I was on a hiking trip through Idaho with my partner, and we had heard of an elusive backcountry hot spring when we were in town and starting out. We got the general location of the hot spring from another hiking group we met at the lodge we were staying in. It was pretty remote, but they claimed it was worth it to make the hike. They camped there for 2 nights and said they didn't see a single soul on the trail there or back. The fall weather was starting to come in, making the idea of the wilderness hot spring seem pretty enticing. There was rumored to be a hot waterfall in the area, fed by the geothermal spring. The other group were unable to find it, but we figured we'd try our luck. We packed our overnight backpacking gear and headed out that morning. The road to the trailhead was a rough drive. We definitely needed to use the 4-wheel drive a couple of times along the way. I remember it was cold. We wore our light, packable winter jackets, but it wasn't quite cold enough yet for parkas. There was no snow on the ground yet, but the night temperature was expected to get below freezing. There was a winter storm on its way, but we planned to be back in town well before then. The hike to the spring was only about 4 miles from the trailhead, but it was challenging to say the least. The trail was rocky and, in some places, very difficult to keep track of. I could see why there weren't many people up there. We made it to the spring a couple of hours before sunset. It was exactly where the other hikers said it would be. And, while the trail had worn us out, slipping into the steaming hot spring was absolutely worth it. The air was cold enough that the steam pooled around the edges like mist. The place was magical. I don't know just how long we stayed in the spring, but it was probably too long for our own good. That night, we set up our little backpacking tent and planned to get up before dawn the next morning and watch the sunrise from the spring. Everything was going perfectly, which usually doesn't happen on backpacking trips, no matter how well you might prepare. But as soon as the sun went down, we started hearing things outside our tent. It sounded like someone was walking around, first by the spring and then near our campsite. At first, we thought it was an animal, but the footsteps were unmistakable. They were human. This hot spring was on national forest land. It was open to the public and camping was allowed wherever you felt like it. So, another hiker coming up here was well within their rights. Maybe they didn't see our tent and were hoping, like we were, that they would be able to enjoy the hot spring before the winter storm rolled in. Neither of us wanted to have a confrontation in the middle of the night in the Idaho forest. You hear all sorts of stories about crazy people out there, and we didn't want to take any chances. It was late in the season, but we both had bear spray canisters with us and kept them close throughout the night. We both got up just before dawn, like we had planned. I was the first to exit the tent and took a look around the area. There was a light dusting of snow on the ground, but nothing that wouldn't melt by midday. I checked for tracks, but there wasn't any sign of the mystery visitor that was wandering around the night before. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I had been imagining it. We ate breakfast, and still no sign of anything or anyone strange, so we decided to go for a soak in the spring before heading back down to the car. As we were heading to the pool, I noticed footprints around the edge. They were bare human feet. There was someone up here with us. The footprints went straight into the forest. There was no trail in that direction, just untamed woods. I couldn't fathom someone walking around without shoes in these temperatures, especially on freshly fallen snow. I was pretty scared, I'll be honest. The thought of someone out there messed up enough to be walking around barefoot had me on edge. For a moment, my mind wandered to the thought that we might not be dealing with a human at all. But I didn't let it stick. I didn't believe in those types of things. I told my partner that someone else had been here and that we should leave. There were no signs of another campsite. I think I knew at that point, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. We started packing up camp, and just as we were getting ready to hike out, I saw it. I just caught a glimpse. It was watching us through the trees. Out of curiosity, maybe. I don't know. But the moment it caught me looking back at it, the creature fled. And it was no human, but I already knew that. I'd bet the creature stood about 7 or 8 feet tall at least. From a distance, it looked like a large black mass. It could have disguised itself in the shadows easily enough, if not for the fresh snow cover on the trees. Its face was unmistakably ape-like. If Bigfoot was indeed real, I was staring right at it. I was shocked at how quickly and quietly it moved through the trees. And then the creature was gone, as if it never existed to begin with. So there we were, standing frozen in our tracks, both of us just looking at each other. I mean, what do you do when you see something like that? It was like a scene out of a movie, only this was real life, and I had no script to follow. My partner and I were completely on edge, glancing around to make sure we were really alone. The eerie silence of the woods was amplified by the reality of what we just saw. We packed up our gear as quickly as possible, making sure we didn't leave anything behind. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature again. The hike back to the car felt like an eternity. Every sound in the forest made us jump. We both knew we were being paranoid, but it was like the woods themselves had come alive. The thought of the creature following us, watching us from behind the trees, weighed heavily on our minds. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear in the trunk and got in as fast as we could, locking the doors and starting the engine. It was only when we were on the road, miles away from where we saw the creature, that we finally started to breathe easier. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What could we say? It was like we both needed time to process what we'd experienced. I remember glancing over at my partner, his face pale, his eyes wide, and I knew he was thinking the same thing as me. What the heck just happened? Later, at a diner on the way home, we finally started to talk about it. We went over the details again and again, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Was it really Bigfoot, or was it just our minds playing tricks on us? The rational part of me kept trying to find a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew what I saw. Since that day, I've never felt the same about the woods. I still love hiking and being outdoors, but there's always a little voice in the back of my head, wondering if I'll see it again. I guess it's one of those experiences that changes you, you know? I don't know if I believe in Bigfoot, but I believe in what I saw that day. And every time I hear a story about someone seeing something unexplainable in the woods, I can't help but think back to that morning, to those footprints in the snow, and to that large black mass disappearing into the trees. It's a memory that's as clear as day, and one that I'll never forget. So next time you're out in the woods, keep an eye out. You never know what might be out there, watching you from behind the trees. But hey, don't let my story keep you from enjoying the great outdoors. Just remember, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. I worked for a gas company that serviced the city of Fort Stockton, Texas, for about 15 years. Most of my job was installing gas meters and doing inspections. Not the most exciting gig, but the pay was decent, and my dad had worked for the same company. Fort Stockton was about a 2-hour drive from Big Bend National Park. If you've ever been to the area, you'll know there have been some strange goings-on around there. It's a beautiful place, don't get me wrong, but I've heard one too many ghost stories to be ever going down there at night. I'm not saying I'm superstitious, but there are things out there that shouldn't be, and I've seen one of them for myself. I was running late on my last job of the day. It was just before 6 o'clock when I got a call about a potential gas leak. The house was a 45-minute drive into the desert, but when we get a call about a gas leak, it's urgent. It can't wait until tomorrow. Way too dangerous. It was dark when I was driving back to the shop. I couldn't tell what the animal was. I just saw a flash of black dart across the road. It ran right out in front of my truck. I didn't have time to stop. I hit the thing dead on, T-boned it. Whatever it was went skidding across the freeway and into the ditch. I pulled the truck over to assess the damage. The whole front end was smashed and smoke was pluming up from the radiator. This thing had to have been huge. If this were my own truck, I might have tried to limp it home and deal with it there. But it was a company truck, so I had to call my boss and then call the police to get a police report. I figured I'd deal with the truck first and then go and check on the thing that I had hit. My boss called a wrecker, and I waited on the side of the freeway for them and the police to show up. All of this is pretty standard for the police. They blocked off the shoulder of the freeway and wrote up a report confirming the incident and the damage to the truck. The officer took a look at the truck and asked if I thought I hit a bear. There was a lot of damage, he said. And he also said twice that he was surprised I wasn't injured. Luckily, I was in the company truck instead of my sedan, because apparently I don't think I'd be alive if I was. I told him I didn't think it was a bear, but I wasn't sure. I went along with the officer as he followed the blood trail of the animal, following it into the ditch. We eventually found it lying about 30 yards off the road down in some brush. We were both speechless when we saw it. We looked at each other and then back down at the body. Neither of us needed to say anything. We knew what the other was thinking. This just wasn't possible. The creature lying there dead in the ditch was a jaguar, a black jaguar. There was no mistaking it. Now, I'm not a biologist or anything, but I've been to the zoo. I know what a jaguar looks like. I know what a bobcat looks like. I know what a mountain lion looks like. And I know what a house cat looks like. And this was a goddamn jaguar. The police officer ended up calling someone from Parks and Wildlife to come out. Luckily, the tow truck was behind schedule, so I got to hang around and see what they were going to say about it. Meanwhile, a whole fleet of vehicles showed up to retrieve the body. I thought that seemed strange, and everyone from the fleet looked really serious. A few of them even looked like undercover government officials to me. But what do I know? They pulled the dead jaguar onto the road before loading it into the back of a covered pickup truck. And I'll tell you again, this was definitely a jaguar. These things are claimed to be extinct in Texas, though they used to be native to the area. The last confirmed jaguar was supposedly shot in 1948. If you ask Parks and Wildlife, they'll tell you there are no jaguars in the state. None at all. The wildlife guy looked me right in the eyes and told me it was a melanistic mountain lion, not a jaguar. I pointed to the body and said, "You and I both know that isn't a mountain lion." He told me if I kept going on about jaguars, that he was going to have to call an ambulance to have me checked out for concussion or brain injury. The look on his face told me he wasn't joking, and I took that as an indication to shut up. Before he left me alone, he asked to see my phone, and I knew for certain that if I didn't hand it over, I would likely find myself in a padded room that night. The only thing he looked at was my camera files. I watched as he even quickly maneuvered himself through my deleted and hidden folders in my camera app. He eventually gave me back the phone when he didn't find anything. I mean, he was very stealthy and was no way just a normal old parks and wildlife guy. And then that was that. The tow truck came and I caught a ride back with them, knowing full well that there was a dead jaguar in the back of the parks and wildlife truck, even though they claimed it was something else. Maybe this isn't the right show for this story, but I don't know who else to tell. I don't know what the cover-up is about. It's not like this is some mythical beast. These things are real animals. We know they exist in the world. And I can tell you firsthand that while they might have been extinct in Texas at one point, they are back now, or at the very least they are being hidden nearby. And this one escaped. This next story comes to us from a listener in Oregon. I just wanted to jump in here and say that I'm not sure how much I believe this one. But then again, who knows what all really exists out there? So anyway, here it is. Tumalo Falls in Oregon has always been my favorite place to hike. I've been hiking most of my life. It started when I was real young. Back in those days, my dad would carry me in a pack on his back for miles and miles, up the sides of hills and down into canyons. Every family vacation we ever took was a hiking trip. When I first moved to Oregon, I naturally started looking for the best hiking spots to spend my weekends and time off work. Tumalo Falls was easily the best. I loved hiking to the top of the waterfall, and I loved having the view of the waterfall as I hiked toward it. I also loved that there were plenty of off-the-beaten-path places to explore, but always a trail nearby and the sound of the waterfall to guide you, especially if you wound up getting yourself turned around. Also, there weren't many people there. I was stunned by how rarely I ran into other hikers. One day, I did run across a hiker, though, who seemed somehow strange. To me, he looked paranoid and was sweating and struggling to maintain his composure. He came straight up to me and very seriously asked me where we were, and I told him we were at Tumalo Falls. He asked what year it was, and I told him it was 2007, which it was. There was an unmistakable look of relief that spread across his face as he realized he was wherever he was supposed to be. He then told me to turn around. Don't go any further into those woods. I asked why not, and he told me to just listen to him as he ran off toward the parking area. I am not someone that is easily scared off, and I was familiar with the area. So in fact, it only inspired me to walk further in. Whatever had shaken him up in there, I wanted to find it. I seemed to walk forever, and nothing really stood out to me as being terrifying or worrisome. I couldn't figure out what had caused the guy to behave in such a way, so I just chalked it up to something I would never figure out. When I turned around to head back, though, I did start to notice something very strange. The walking paths that were so evident only moments before now weren't visible. I wondered if I had really walked that far off the path, and that I just couldn't see them anymore. Well, the idea of that made me panic a little bit. I remembered my dad telling me that if you're ever lost in the woods, you should set up some kind of marker so you can tell if you're walking in circles. Fortunately, I had a red handkerchief in my pocket, so I tied it around a slim tree branch, then started exploring the area. It didn't take long for me to start noticing more weird stuff. I came across an area in the mud where it looked like several horses had come through. I tried counting and figured at least 10 or 11 horses had come through, all heading in the same direction. There was no indication they'd wandered from their path, so I assumed there were riders, maybe trail riders from the local stable club. I decided to follow the hooves for a while and see if I might come up on the group. Maybe they'd have some idea of what had happened to my wild-eyed new friend I just met further down the trail. When I came over the hill, though, I couldn't believe my eyes. It wasn't a bunch of riders from the stable club. It was a bunch of what looked like cowboys on horseback, and at the bottom of the hill were several covered wagons, the type you'd see in an old Western movie. I figured they must be some kind of reenactment, maybe of the Oregon Trail, so I decided to approach and ask. I was impressed with the authenticity of their costumes and the wagons, and wanted to see them up close. When they saw me approaching, though, they looked like they'd seen a ghost. Now, this is where I should probably tell you that I am a dark-skinned person. My mother is Indian and my father is Pakistani. While I'm not a Native American, I probably look close enough to these folks. So all at once, I find myself with several guns pointed right at me. They started yelling, asking me what tribe I belonged to and scanning the horizon, as if they thought there might be more of me coming. I still wasn't sure what was going on, but thought their reception of me was really off and old-fashioned. I'd even go so far as to say inappropriate, even if they were trying to stay in character, and I proceeded to tell them as much. This is when they just looked at me, even more confused, and asked me what the hell I wanted. I told them I'd come to compliment them, but had changed my mind. They said something about my friend having already been by there, and not to send anyone else. Then I heard a woman comment on how funny we dressed. Then I turned to walk back the other way, and that's when one of them shot the ground by my feet to hurry me along. Only then did I realize the guns they were aiming at me were real, and I set off running as fast as I could until I found that handkerchief. I grabbed it from the tree and headed back the direction I'd come from when I first tied it. All at once, after I'd run a little bit, I realized I could see the trails again. I turned and looked, and the trails stretched back as far as the eye could see. I have no explanation for why they weren't visible to me before that. Well, mostly no explanation. I read online a few weeks after that about how portals to the past have opened up in secluded areas a few times throughout history. I'm convinced that's exactly what happened to me that day. Believe it or not, this is a true story. The details are just too vivid. At first, I didn't mind the job. It was 2002 and it was pretty good money for this part of Kansas. Also, it was close to my hometown, which made the drive easier. It was only a 20-minute drive out to the restaurant where I worked on the outskirts of town, in a sort of industrial area. The area was surrounded by trees, which made it kind of dark and creepy. The clientele ranged from truckers who stopped in for coffee on their way through town to loggers who were just getting off work. The bar looked like most others in this part of Kansas, pretty run down and seedy. It seemed that the only thing the place had going for it was the fact that it stayed open late. They were open from dinner time until 2 in the morning most nights, and 24 hours a day until late Saturday night, or basically 2 a.m. on Sunday. I had been there a few hours at this point, and it was pretty slow, so that day I had been spending most of my time behind the bar reading a copy of The Purpose-Driven Life that I had gotten from one of the customers the night before. Most patrons were regulars, local men who drank there, just about every night of the week. After about an hour passed and it still wasn't very busy, so I decided to go back into the kitchen where I was washing some glasses and plates that I had been avoiding in the sink. When I came back out into the bar a few minutes later, one of my regulars was sitting on his usual bar stool. He was a lumberjack type of guy, tall and burly, but as nice as can be. Or as my grandma always said, as red as the mud on my boots. His name was Charles, and he had a big bushy mustache and long hair, and always wore jeans and flannel shirts. Well, I got behind the bar and instantly I could see that he looked bothered. He was looking around the bar kind of frantically asking, "Did you see it?" I asked him if he was okay, and when he didn't respond and just kept looking around frantically, I got a little freaked out. It's like he was having an episode or something, like his brain sort of wasn't fully there. And that's when I looked to my right and saw the back door of the place wide open. I knew it wasn't open when I had just been back there washing the dishes, and I hadn't seen anyone else go back there, which gave me actual goosebumps. Charles was now fixated on the back room, so I moved over and started to look back there myself. And that's when I saw a huge brownish, orangish, dog-like creature just standing there in the doorway. It just stood there staring at me and me back at it. Our eyes had locked and our bodies were still as we both checked each other out. The staring contest lasted for what seemed like forever, until finally it looked over at Charles. Breaking my gaze with the creature caused it to growl and hiss at us both, and then it turned around, ran out the back door and off into the woods. The creature was really big, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, and it looked like a dog standing there on 2 legs. The thing's face looked more like an ape than a dog, with kind of yellowish eyes and human-like teeth. First glance, it looked like a dog. But as I stared in disbelief, my eyes clearly saw that this dog was really something different. What stood in front of me was more like a dog or an ape hybrid or something. I was so terrified when I was standing there that I couldn't move. After what seemed like forever, Charles, who had been staring in disbelief at the creature too, finally snapped out of it. He stood up from his bar stool and pulled a gun out of his jacket pocket and headed out the back door. And that's when I did something I'll never be able to explain. When he walked out the back door, I grabbed a flashlight and followed him. Something inside me told me to follow him, go out there and see what was happening. There isn't even a word in the English language to describe how terrified I was as we walked out that door and towards the woods, and yet I still went. Looking back, I have no idea what possessed me to do it. As we looked around the outside of the back door, we saw what appeared to be dog paw tracks pacing back and forth just outside the door. It's as if it had been inspecting us, just watching us for a while before opening the door and coming inside. Charles suddenly seemed to calm down and started to talk about how these creatures have been sighted in those woods for years, and that sightings go back all the way to the 1800s. His family has been in the area for generations, so I totally believe him. We walked towards the woods, and not before long we could hear something, or someone moving through the woods. We stopped and looked at each other. To me, it sounded like an animal making contact with leaves and sticks, like it was walking through the brush, but moving quickly. We followed the sounds, which took us down into this sort of dip in the land where rainwater creates a small ditch. Charles suddenly put his finger up to his mouth and shushed me, pointing down. I followed his finger, and there, standing about 100 feet from us, was the dog man. It was standing down from us, just looking around slowly, with its head tilted kind of sideways. Standing there and looking at this creature was the most terrifying experience of my life, hands down. It looked like a dog standing on its hind legs, but at the same time it wasn't a dog at all. I don't know how else to explain it except that was a dog, but not a dog, yet still a dog that also looked like a human. I think the human part mainly came from the shape of its arms and legs and torso, but also from its eyes that seemed to be able to talk to me without its mouth moving or saying anything. Honestly, like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. And then the creature just turned and looked at us, and then it moved. It darted towards us and then turned in an instant and ran off into the woods, howling like a wolf as it ran. Charles and I stood there forever, it seemed, just looking at its tracks in the ground leading off to where it had gone. Charles looked at me and said, "We should probably go back." He was smart to not want to follow it into the woods, into its territory, and so we went back. "You were right to not follow it," I said as I started to dial 911, but then stopped before the call connected. What if they don't believe me? I wondered out loud. What if they think our story is fake? So I never did call the police, but I never forgot or got over that creature either. I never told anyone about what happened that night until now, with my writing this to you. To be honest, when I look back on it, I really don't know what we saw that night, like what exactly it was. Charles and I kept in touch for a while, but when I stopped working at the restaurant, our contact dropped off. I don't know how he's doing, but I sometimes think about trying to find him and see how he is. What I do know is that it was real, and its image will never leave me. It's literally in my head, behind my eyes. As I write these words to you, I can see it all the time. Honestly, I can just close my eyes and see it exactly like it was that night. And sometimes when the lights are out at night, I swear I can feel someone watching me from the foot of my bed. Have any of you had these similar experiences?